Consider the simple statement, "This sentence is false." When you examine it carefully, you will find yourself caught in a logical loop that has no exit, a paradox that has haunted philosophers and mathematicians for centuries, one that seems to operate in the space between truth and falsehood without ever fully inhabiting either realm. If the sentence is true, then what it asserts must be the case, which means it is false, but if it is false, then its assertion is incorrect, which would make it true, and so the cycle continues endlessly without resolution. This is the liar's paradox in its most distilled form, a self-referential statement that talks about its own truth value and thereby creates an infinite regression that our minds struggle to process or settle. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves the way human consciousness attempts to assign truth values to every proposition it encounters, operating under the assumption that every statement must be either true or false, with no middle ground between these two possibilities. When we encounter a statement that refuses to resolve into either category, our cognitive systems experience a kind of friction, a resistance to the normal process of comprehension and categorization that we rely upon constantly in our everyday understanding of language and reality. The brain expects language to map cleanly onto the world, expects statements to refer to external facts or internal states that can be verified or falsified, yet this sentence refers only to itself and its own status, creating a strange loop that turns language back upon itself like a snake consuming its own tail. Yet despite its apparent simplicity, this paradox has proven remarkably resistant to resolution, spawning entire branches of logic and philosophy devoted to understanding how language can fold back upon itself in ways that seem to violate the fundamental rules we use to make sense of meaning itself, suggesting that perhaps the binary categories of true and false are themselves inadequate tools for capturing the full complexity of how language actually functions in the world. Some have proposed that the solution lies in recognizing degrees of truth rather than absolute binaries, or in distinguishing between the language we use to describe the world and the metalanguage we use to describe language itself. Yet even these sophisticated frameworks struggle to fully contain the paradox's recursive nature. What remains perhaps most unsettling is that this humble 9-word sentence continues to reveal new layers of complexity the more rigorously we examine it, suggesting that language itself may harbor logical depths we have scarcely begun to fathom. And perhaps this is why the liar's paradox has survived every attempt at formal resolution. It functions less as a logical problem to be solved and more as a mirror held up to the limitations of our conceptual frameworks, revealing that the very tools we have constructed to understand reality may contain hidden assumptions that are themselves open to question. In this sense, the paradox becomes not merely an obstacle to overcome, but an invitation to examine the foundations upon which all our reasoning rests. Consider the peculiar landscape of the American West, where herds of large bison once roamed across vast plains in numbers so tremendous that they seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. And imagine now that we are examining how a single English word, when repeated with precise grammatical intentionality, can construct a sentence of complete semantic validity while simultaneously violating every intuitive expectation we hold about how language should function. The word buffalo operates simultaneously as a noun referring to the animal itself, as a proper noun designating the city in western New York State, and as a verb meaning to intimidate or confuse through bluffing or deception, a verb form that originates from the animal's name itself through a process of semantic drift that occurred over generations of language use. When we arrange these three distinct grammatical functions in sequence, we create a statement that reads as follows. Buffalo, which are bison from Buffalo, New York, intimidate other buffalo through their aggressive behavior, or more precisely, bison from the city of Buffalo intimidate bison through deceptive intimidation tactics. The mechanism that allows this paradox to function rests upon the principle that homonyms, words identical in spelling but divergent in meaning and often in pronunciation, can occupy the same space within a sentence without creating ambiguity if one understands the underlying grammatical structure and the contextual constraints that govern each word's function. Our brains process language not as isolated units, but as syntactic patterns and semantic relationships, allowing us to parse meaning from sequences that would otherwise appear meaningless to anyone unfamiliar with the hidden architecture beneath the surface. Yet we have normalized this linguistic phenomenon so thoroughly within academic and linguistic circles that it persists as a celebrated example of English language's capacity for structural density, remaining immune to the logical objections it might otherwise provoke, because we have accepted that language need not be immediately transparent or easily intuited to remain valid and meaningful. This tolerance for linguistic opacity extends beyond buffalo into countless other English constructions, where homonyms and polysemy create similar densities of meaning. Consider the complex or the noun verbs, reminding us that language's true power lies not in its transparency, but in its capacity to encode multiple layers of significance within deceptively simple surface structures, making it a medium far more sophisticated than any artificial system we have yet devised. Consider a moment when you find yourself sitting in a quiet room, perhaps late in the evening, and you begin to contemplate a sentence that seems perfectly grammatical and yet utterly meaningless. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. The words arrange themselves in proper English syntax, each word occupying its correct grammatical position, each verb agreeing with its subject, each adjective preceding its noun in the customary order that native speakers recognize instinctively. You can parse the sentence without difficulty, identifying the subject, the predicate, the modifiers, and yet when you attempt to imagine what this phrase actually describes, your mind encounters a peculiar emptiness, a void where semantic content should exist. The sentence follows all the rules of language construction that we have internalized since childhood, the deep structures that allow us to generate and understand infinite new expressions, and yet it communicates nothing about the physical world or any conceivable experience. This is the essential paradox. Grammar and meaning, two elements we assume must travel together, suddenly diverge completely. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon reveals something profound about how our minds process language, for we possess two distinct systems operating simultaneously, one that checks grammatical legitimacy and another that searches for meaningful content. When these two systems receive contradictory signals, confusion blooms, a gentle cognitive dissonance that feels almost meditative in its strangeness. We have become so accustomed to the assumption that grammatically correct sentences must mean something, that grammatical form and semantic sense are inseparable partners in communication, that we rarely pause to recognize how often this assumption fails. Throughout literature and everyday speech, we encounter perfectly formed sentences that describe impossible situations, contradictory states, and logically incoherent scenarios, yet we have normalized these utterances so thoroughly that they no longer strike us as paradoxical. We accept that we can speak of round squares and married bachelors, that we can describe the sound of silence and feel the weight of emptiness, and we navigate this landscape of linguistic impossibility without conscious awareness that we are doing anything unusual at all. Yet perhaps this capacity for meaningful nonsense is not a flaw in our linguistic system, but rather its greatest strength, for it permits us to imagine beyond the boundaries of what exists, to entertain hypotheticals and impossibilities that expand the territory of human thought, allowing us to dream in language of worlds that have never been and may never be. In this way, the sentence, "colorless green ideas sleep furiously," becomes less a linguistic curiosity and more a gateway into the deepest functions of human cognition. A reminder that we are creatures who can hold contradictions in our minds, who can find meaning in meaninglessness, and who use language not merely to describe reality as it is, but to conjure possibilities that transcend it entirely. Consider the simple statement, "This sentence is false." When you examine this declaration closely, you find yourself trapped in a loop of contradiction that has puzzled philosophers and logicians for thousands of years, stretching back to ancient Greece where Eubulides of Miletus first articulated this troubling formulation. If the statement is true, then what it claims must be accurate, meaning the sentence itself is false, which contradicts our initial assumption that it was true. But if we instead assume the statement is false, then it accurately describes itself as false, which would make it true, creating yet another reversal of our assumption. This perpetual oscillation between truth and falsehood demonstrates a fundamental breakdown in how language operates when it turns its reflective gaze upon itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profound about the nature of self-reference and the limitations built into formal systems of logic. When a statement makes a claim about its own truth value, it creates a strange loop that cannot be resolved through conventional means, because every resolution leads directly back to its opposite. Our minds instinctively seek stable truth values for statements, expecting that any given sentence must be either true or false. Yet this particular construction refuses to settle into either category, leaving us in a state of cognitive suspension. What makes the liar paradox particularly fascinating is how we have normalized and accepted its existence despite the logical crisis it represents. Rather than abandoning language or logic entirely, philosophers and mathematicians developed increasingly sophisticated frameworks to accommodate these self-referential statements, including multi-valued logic systems, semantic hierarchies, and formal restrictions on what counts as a valid proposition. We continue speaking and thinking despite knowing that language contains these irresolvable contradictions within itself, suggesting that our need for meaningful communication supersedes our requirement for perfect logical consistency, and we have learned to live productively within this paradoxical reality. Perhaps the most humbling insight is that the liar paradox doesn't represent a failure of language or logic, but rather reveals the price of having a system complex enough to contain statements about itself. A cost we willingly bear because self-reflection, despite its dangers, is what enables growth, understanding, and the very philosophical inquiry that allows us to contemplate these paradoxes in the first place. In this sense, the liar paradox becomes not merely a logical puzzle to solve, but an invitation to recognize that the deepest truths about ourselves and our systems of meaning often emerge precisely at the points where they seem to break down, reminding us that contradiction and coherence are not enemies, but essential partners in any framework complex enough to achieve self-awareness. Consider the simple phrase that has become the foundation of an entire linguistic cautionary tale, a sentence so ordinary in its construction, yet so catastrophic in its ambiguity that it serves as a perfect mirror reflecting the fragile nature of written communication itself. The phrase, "let's eat, Grandma," exists in our language as a cheerful dinner invitation, a moment where family members gather around a table and share a meal together, a warmth and togetherness that most people experience with genuine affection and comfort. However, remove that single punctuation mark, that tiny comma that separates meaning from darkness, and the same exact letters and words transform into something profoundly disturbing, a statement that suggests cannibalism, that transforms the beloved grandmother from dinner companion to dinner itself, collapsing the boundary between subject and object with terrifying efficiency. The mechanism behind this paradox operates through what linguists call syntactic ambiguity, where the grammatical structure of a sentence can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on how we parse its components, how we group the words together, and where we place our pauses both written and spoken. When the comma exists, "let's eat" becomes a complete verb phrase with an implied object, followed by a direct address to Grandma, inviting her to participate in the meal. When the comma vanishes, "let's eat, Grandma" transforms the sentence into a statement of intention, where Grandma transitions from being addressed as a person to being positioned as the direct object of consumption, the thing being eaten rather than the one who eats. What makes this particular paradox especially striking is how it has persisted in our cultural consciousness as a teaching tool, shared endlessly across internet forums and classrooms as a demonstration of why punctuation matters. Yet simultaneously, it reveals something deeper about how our brains process language in real time. When we hear this phrase spoken aloud, the comma disappears entirely, the distinction evaporates into thin air, and only context and tone can save us from ambiguity, which means that spoken language lives in a state of constant negotiation with intention and interpretation. Despite the fact that this paradox should theoretically make us paranoid about every sentence we speak or write, we have normalized it completely, accepting that language is inherently slippery, and that meaning is always negotiated between speaker and listener, writer and reader, in ways that no amount of grammatical precision can fully control. Yet perhaps this acceptance itself is the real punctuation mark that saves us, a collective understanding that meaning emerges not from perfect grammar, but from the goodwill between communicators, a shared commitment to interpret charitably rather than catastrophically, which is why we can live in a world full of ambiguous sentences without descending into cannibalistic misunderstandings. In this light, "let's eat, Grandma" becomes less a warning about grammar and more a celebration of the implicit trust that holds language together, the assumption that when someone invites you to dinner, they mean exactly what the comma intends. Consider the moment when you glance at a clock expecting mere minutes to have passed, only to discover that hours have dissolved into the past without your conscious awareness, leaving behind only a sense of bewilderment and the vague impression that something fundamental has slipped through your grasp like water through open fingers. This phenomenon, which we casually describe as time flying, presents us with a linguistic paradox of considerable depth, for we have constructed an entire metaphorical framework around the notion that time possesses velocity and direction, moving with the swiftness and purposefulness of an arrow in flight toward some distant and predetermined target. In reality, of course, time does not move at all in any conventional sense. Rather, we move through time, or more accurately, we experience the continuous unfolding of causality and change in the universe around us, yet our language has inverted this relationship entirely, casting time itself as an active agent hurtling forward with relentless momentum. The psychological mechanism underlying this peculiar inversion stems from the human brain's remarkable capacity to construct narratives and assign agency to abstract concepts, particularly when those concepts prove difficult to grasp directly through sensory experience. When we become deeply engaged in an activity that captures our full attention, our brain's monitoring systems for temporal passage essentially fall silent, and the subjective experience of duration compresses dramatically, creating the powerful illusion that external time itself has accelerated beyond its normal pace, when in fact our internal perception of it has simply been disrupted or suspended. We describe this acceleration using the metaphor of flight because arrows represent speed, directional purpose, and an inexorable forward momentum that cannot be stopped or reversed once released. And this metaphor carries with it an emotional resonance that captures something true about our experience, even though it fundamentally misrepresents the nature of time itself. Despite centuries of scientific understanding that time is not an entity with agency or velocity, but rather a dimension through which change and causality unfold, we continue to speak of time flying, running, crawling, and moving at various speeds, normalizing this linguistically inverted perspective to such a degree that alternative framings seem almost unnatural and difficult to articulate. The persistence of this paradox reveals something profound about human cognition. We are creatures who understand abstract concepts primarily through metaphor and embodied experience, and once a metaphorical framework becomes embedded in our language, it shapes not only how we speak, but how we think, even when it contradicts the actual nature of the phenomenon it purports to describe. Consider the famous wooden puppet whose nose grows whenever he tells a lie, a character that has haunted our collective imagination for generations with a peculiar logical puzzle embedded within his very nature. Imagine Pinocchio uttering the statement, "My nose will grow right now," and as he speaks these words, we encounter a problem that unfolds like a recursive loop within the fabric of language itself. If his statement is true, then his nose will indeed grow, which would make the prediction accurate and therefore his words were honest rather than deceptive. Yet if his nose grows due to an honest statement, then he was not lying, so according to the magical rules that govern him, his nose should not grow at all. Conversely, if his statement is false and his nose does not grow, then his prediction turned out to be accurate, making it a true statement rather than a false one, which means he should not have lied, and therefore his nose should actually grow, creating an endless cycle of contradiction. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the collision between self-referential statements and systems of rules that depend upon clear distinctions between truth and falsehood, where the statement reaches back and comments upon itself in ways that break the logical foundations upon which those very systems stand. This paradox reveals how language can fold back upon itself like a Möbius strip, transforming the clear boundaries we expect into something far more fluid and paradoxical. We encounter this same logical structure scattered throughout mathematics, philosophy, and even everyday conversation. Yet we rarely pause to acknowledge how deeply strange it is that such contradictions can exist at all within systems we treat as fundamentally stable and coherent, continuing to use language and logic as though these internal inconsistencies do not persist in the background of our most basic ways of understanding reality. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of such paradoxes is that they suggest our logical systems are not merely incomplete, but fundamentally limited in their ability to capture certain truths about reality, limitations we might never fully overcome, only learn to navigate with greater awareness and humility. Yet perhaps this is not a flaw to be corrected, but rather a feature of any sufficiently rich language, a necessary cost of having symbols flexible enough to refer to themselves and the systems that govern them. In learning to live with paradox rather than eliminate it, we may develop a more sophisticated understanding of truth itself, one that acknowledges the strange beauty of a world where meaning can coexist with contradiction. And so Pinocchio's nose becomes not merely a magical artifact, but a mirror reflecting back the deepest structures of thought itself. A wooden reminder that the very tools we use to understand reality may contain within them the seeds of their own undoing, inviting us to question whether perfect logical consistency is a feature of the universe or merely a comforting fiction we have constructed. Consider the peculiar linguistic phenomenon known as heterological words, which exists in that strange territory where language describes itself and creates impossible logical loops that seem to undermine the very foundations of semantic meaning. A heterological word is one that does not describe itself, such as the word monosyllabic, which is itself polysyllabic and therefore does not possess the quality it names, or the word abstract, which is somehow both abstract and concrete depending on how you examine it, or perhaps most famously the word abbreviation, which is quite long and therefore does not abbreviate itself in any meaningful way. The inverse exists as well with autological words, those rare linguistic unicorns that do describe themselves, such as polysyllabic, which is itself polysyllabic, or noun, which is itself a noun, creating these perfect self-referential loops that feel almost too elegant to be accidental. The mechanism behind this paradox emerges from the fundamental gap between the sign and the signified, between the word as a physical object existing in space and time, and the word as a carrier of meaning and conceptual content. When we use language to describe language itself, we create a strange recursive hall of mirrors where the tool becomes the subject of its own inquiry, and the rules that govern ordinary discourse suddenly bend and fold back upon themselves in ways that seem to violate the basic contract of communication. We have somehow normalized this philosophical puzzle, treating it as merely an amusing quirk of linguistics, rather than confronting the deeper truth it reveals about the arbitrary nature of our symbolic systems, and perhaps about the limitations of any system attempting to fully describe itself from within its own boundaries. The heterological paradox persists not because we have solved it, but because we have learned to live comfortably alongside it, much like we accept the strangeness of consciousness itself without fully understanding it. And perhaps this is the deepest insight of all, that language, like consciousness, contains within itself the seeds of its own undoing, a built-in limitation that no amount of refinement or logical rigor can overcome, suggesting that some paradoxes are not bugs in the system, but fundamental features of how meaning-making itself must operate. To test this hypothesis, one need only attempt to construct a complete and self-describing language, a symbolic system that could fully account for itself without remainder or contradiction, and watch as the project inevitably encounters the same recursive obstacles, suggesting that self-reference and paradox are not incidental features of language, but rather intrinsic to any system complex enough to represent its own operations. In this light, the heterological paradox becomes less a logical problem awaiting solution and more a mirror held up to the nature of consciousness itself, a reminder that any mind sufficiently complex to contemplate its own existence will inevitably encounter boundaries it cannot cross, leaving us forever on the inside of the system, attempting to comprehend its own architecture. Consider the simple act of repeating a word over and over again, perhaps beginning with something as ordinary as the word chair or blue or water, and continuing to say it aloud with perfect clarity and intention, with no variation in tone or emphasis, just the same syllables emerging from your mouth in steady succession, one after another, until something peculiar and undeniable begins to happen. The word itself seems to lose its meaning, the connection between the sound you are producing and the concept it is supposed to represent begins to dissolve, and what was once a familiar vessel of communication transforms into nothing more than a strange collection of phonetic vibrations that no longer carries any semantic weight whatsoever. This phenomenon is known as semantic satiation, and it represents one of the most fascinating contradictions in how human consciousness processes language and meaning. The mechanism underlying this experience appears to be rooted in the way our neurons respond to repeated stimulation, as the specific neural pathways associated with a particular word's meaning become fatigued through continuous activation. leading them to temporarily cease firing with the same vigor and efficiency they once demonstrated, which essentially causes the word to become cognitively unavailable to us even though we continue to perceive the sound itself. What makes this paradox particularly compelling is that it reveals the entirely constructed nature of linguistic meaning, the fact that words do not possess inherent meaning independent of our neural processing, but rather derive their significance from the health and vitality of the neural networks that support them. Yet we have built an entire civilization based on the assumption that words carry stable, permanent meaning that exists outside of our biological limitations. We speak as though language is a reliable tool for conveying truth and understanding, as though the connection between a word and its referent is something unshakable and fundamental, when in reality it takes only the simple act of repetition to demonstrate how fragile and contingent this connection truly is, and how easily the foundations of our most basic communicative abilities can be undermined by the simple mechanics of neural fatigue and stimulus satiation. Yet perhaps this vulnerability is not a flaw, but rather an essential feature, a built-in reminder that meaning is not something we discover in the world, but something we actively create and sustain through the ongoing vitality of our engagement with language, and that the moment we cease to refresh and renew our relationship with words through varied usage and conscious attention, we risk losing touch with the very concepts that structure our understanding of reality itself. Perhaps this is why poetry, with its deliberate repetition and ritualistic return to familiar words, can suddenly illuminate meaning that ordinary speech has rendered invisible. By breaking the automaticity of our neural responses, it forces us to encounter language as though for the first time, restoring the vitality that semantic satiation had temporarily stolen away. Imagine standing in a library where a librarian has created a catalog of all the books in that library, and this catalog itself becomes a book that must be included in the catalog, which then requires a new edition of the catalog to include itself, spiraling endlessly into recursive self-reference. This is the essential nature of the Barber Paradox, a linguistic puzzle that emerges from what seems like a simple and innocent attempt to define something through language. The paradox begins when we consider the phrase, the smallest positive integer not definable in under 60 characters, a description that appears straightforward enough, yet contains within it the seeds of logical contradiction. For if we can name this number through this very description, and if this description contains fewer than 60 characters, then we have just defined in fewer than 60 characters the number that supposedly cannot be defined in fewer than 60 characters, creating an impossible loop where truth and falsity collapse into each other like waves meeting their own reflection. The mechanism behind this paradox rests on a profound confusion about what language actually does when it attempts to refer to mathematical objects and logical concepts. We tend to assume that there is a clean separation between the act of describing something and the thing itself being described, yet the Barber Paradox reveals that this assumption may be naive when language becomes self-referential and begins to fold back upon itself. The problem arises because natural language, unlike the formal systems of mathematics, contains an inherent vagueness about what counts as a definition, what counts as a character, and most crucially, what counts as being definable in the first place. When we try to pin down these concepts precisely, we find that the ground beneath our feet keeps shifting, like trying to grasp smoke or measure the exact moment when day becomes night. What makes this paradox persist despite its fundamental illogic is that we have not yet developed a universally accepted framework that cleanly resolves the tension between formal mathematical rigor and the fuzzy, intuitive nature of ordinary language. Philosophers and logicians continue to debate whether the Barber Paradox represents a genuine flaw in our logical systems, or merely reveals the limitations of applying natural language to problems that properly belong to formal logic alone. We have learned to live with this unresolved tension, treating it as a curious intellectual artifact rather than a crisis requiring immediate solution, much as we have learned to coexist with other paradoxes that lurk in the foundations of mathematics and language itself. Yet in recognizing this limitation, we gain something valuable, an appreciation for the delicate boundary between what can be said with precision and what must remain somewhat elusive, a boundary that the Barber Paradox illuminates with remarkable clarity. In this light, the paradox becomes less a problem to be solved and more a teacher that shows us where language reaches the edge of its own capacity to describe itself. In the 1928 edition of Merriam-Webster's New International Dictionary, tucked between the entries for dormer and dorm, there appeared a peculiar word that would haunt the halls of lexicography for years to come. Dord, defined innocently as a unit of mass equal to 1/16 of a dram in physics and chemistry. The word seemed legitimate enough to pass through the editorial process, survived the printing presses, and made its way into thousands of households and libraries across the United States, where it was consulted by students, scholars, and curious minds seeking authoritative knowledge about the English language. The problem, however, was that Dord had never actually existed before, spawned not from centuries of linguistic tradition or the natural evolution of speech patterns, but rather from a simple typographical error that somehow transformed into perceived reality through the sheer power of institutional authority and published documentation. The mechanism behind this remarkable occurrence reveals something profound about how language communities establish truth and legitimacy through centralized sources of authority. When a major dictionary publisher includes a word in its pages, that word gains an almost supernatural credibility that transcends the need for actual evidence of its use or existence in everyday communication or academic discourse. Readers and writers alike assume that such a prestigious source would never include fabrications or mistakes, that every entry has been carefully vetted by expert lexicographers who have traced the word's etymology and documented its widespread usage, and that the dictionary itself serves as an ultimate arbiter of what is real and what is not within the realm of language. The very existence of Dord in print created a feedback loop where its inclusion in one dictionary led to its inclusion in others, each subsequent appearance lending further credibility and legitimacy to a word that possessed no actual linguistic foundation whatsoever. Yet despite the eventual discovery of this error, which was finally identified and corrected in 1934, the strange case of Dord persists in our cultural memory as a testament to how fragile our systems of linguistic authority truly are, and how easily falsehood can be embedded into the very reference materials we rely upon to understand the boundaries of our language itself. The discovery of Dord prompted dictionaries to implement more rigorous verification processes, yet similar ghost words have since emerged in other reference materials, reminding us that even our most authoritative institutions remain vulnerable to the human errors that inevitably accompany the monumental task of cataloging language itself. In fact, Dord was eventually joined by other phantom entries such as abacot, a type of headdress that never quite existed, and chi, which, ironically, was initially considered suspect before becoming legitimized through actual usage, demonstrating that the line between error and acceptance in language is far more permeable than we might wish to believe. Consider the word cleave, a term that has managed to contain two entirely opposite meanings within the boundaries of a single linguistic container, functioning simultaneously as both a verb meaning to split apart or separate something into distinct pieces, and as a verb meaning to adhere closely or cling desperately to something. And this duality exists not as a recent linguistic accident, but as a deeply embedded feature of English that persists across centuries of language evolution. When we examine the mechanisms behind such contradictory cohabitation, we discover that contronyms typically arise through processes of historical semantic drift, where a word's original meaning transforms through usage patterns across different regions, time periods, or social contexts, until the modern language user inherits a vocabulary item that points simultaneously in opposite directions. The word dust exemplifies this phenomenon perfectly, as it can mean either to remove fine particles from a surface or to apply fine particles onto a surface, two actions that are mechanically and intentionally inverse yet share the same linguistic designation, forcing speakers and writers to rely entirely on contextual clues to disambiguate the intended meaning. Similarly, sanction contains the capacity to mean either to officially approve and authorize something or to impose punitive measures and restrictions against something, creating a particularly troublesome confusion in diplomatic and legal contexts where precision is not merely preferred, but absolutely essential for proper communication and understanding. The psychological mechanisms that allow us to tolerate and perpetuate such linguistic contradictions rest primarily on our extraordinary contextual awareness and our ability as language users to extract meaning from surrounding sentences, paragraphs, and conversational frameworks rather than from individual word definitions alone. We have developed an almost unconscious competence in navigating these contradictory meanings, processing them rapidly based on the semantic environment in which they appear, much like how we can understand a metaphorical utterance immediately without pausing to reconcile the literal impossibility of the statement. Yet despite the obvious logical dysfunction that contronyms represent, despite the fact that we might reasonably expect language communities to resolve these ambiguities through time by forcing words to choose singular meanings or by abandoning conflicting definitions entirely, we have instead normalized and accepted these paradoxes as permanent features of our linguistic landscape. This acceptance reveals something profound about how language actually functions in practice. It is far more resilient, flexible, and context-dependent than pure logic would suggest, and the redundancy and potential confusion that contronyms introduce appears to pose no genuine threat to effective human communication, allowing us to sleep soundly in the knowledge that our words contain multitudes. Consider the peculiar English word cleave, a term so fundamentally contradictory that it manages to contain within itself two entirely opposite meanings, each equally valid and recognized by every major dictionary in existence. When you cleave something, you might be splitting it apart with force and precision, driving a wedge through wood or separating one object from another with decisive action. Yet simultaneously, to cleave can mean to hold fast, to stick together, to remain closely attached to something or someone with unwavering loyalty and devotion. A husband might cleave unto his wife, clinging to her with all his being, while a butcher cleaves a carcass into distinct portions, tearing asunder what was once whole. The word carries both the meaning of union and division, of joining and separating, of adhesion and fracture all at once, creating a linguistic knot that should theoretically create confusion, but somehow does not prevent us from understanding context with remarkable ease. This contradiction arises from the ancient linguistic history of English, where two separate Germanic roots, both pronounced similarly but carrying opposite semantic weight, eventually merged into a single spelling and pronunciation through the fog of time and linguistic evolution. The Old English cleophan meant to split or divide, while clifin meant to stick or adhere, and somewhere in the journey through Middle English and into the modern language, these distinct words collapsed into one another, their meanings preserved but their forms united. We accept this without pause or difficulty because our brains are extraordinary pattern-matching machines, capable of holding contradictions suspended in the container of context, understanding through surrounding words and situation which meaning is intended even though the word itself remains perfectly ambiguous. Centuries have passed since this merger occurred, and yet rather than resolving the contradiction through language reform or natural selection of one meaning over the other, we have simply become comfortable with the paradox, allowing cleave to remain as one of English's most elegant demonstrations of how meaning is not purely contained within individual words, but distributed across the entire landscape of communication and circumstance. In this way, cleave becomes a mirror held up to language itself, revealing that words are not rigid containers, but fluid vessels shaped by the minds that use them. And it stands as a gentle reminder that contradiction and coherence need not be enemies, that the most honest words are often those capacious enough to hold multitudes. Perhaps this is why cleave has endured for nearly 1,000 years while countless other words have fallen away. Because it does not pretend to simplicity, and in that refusal to simplify, it achieves a kind of truth that no single, unambiguous word could ever capture, teaching us that language at its finest is not the enemy of paradox, but its most eloquent expression. Consider the peculiar situation where you encounter two words that appear to be opposites, yet they mean precisely the same thing, and this linguistic accident has persisted in everyday usage for centuries without resolution or widespread correction. When you look at a bottle of cleaning solution or a canister of paint thinner, you might see the word flammable printed in bold letters, warning you of its dangerous properties. Yet if you were to consult a historical document or an older safety manual, you would find the word inflammable used in the exact same context with the exact same meaning and intention. The prefix in dash dash flammable seems as though it should negate the root word, much like how inactive means not active or insincere means not sincere. Yet inflammable does not mean the opposite of flammable at all. Instead, it comes from the Latin word inflammare, meaning to set on fire or to kindle, and the prefix in dash in this case is intensifying rather than negating, a linguistic phenomenon that occurs in various languages and creates genuine confusion for speakers who encounter it for the first time. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our natural expectation that language follows consistent patterns. So when we see the prefix in dash attached to a word, our brains automatically predict negation based on countless examples like invisible, immoral, or impermanent. And this prediction fails us entirely in the case of inflammable, leaving us in a state of genuine uncertainty about what the word actually means. The real dash life situation where this paradox matters most is in workplace safety and hazard communication, where clarity of language directly impacts human behavior and accident prevention. Yet for decades, both words have coexisted on warning labels and safety documents, occasionally causing confusion among workers who might misinterpret inflammable as a compound word wherein means not. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is that English speakers and safety professionals eventually recognized the potential danger posed by this ambiguity, and in response, they began phasing out inflammable in official contexts during the 20th century, establishing flammable as the standardized term in safety regulations and hazard communication systems. The fact that inflammable persists at all in modern English, despite being largely abandoned in professional and regulatory contexts, demonstrates how deeply certain linguistic forms embed themselves in our collective memory and how the historical weight of a word's usage can outlast its practical utility. We have simply decided to normalize this confusion by choosing one winner and allowing the other to fade into archaic usage. Yet the paradox remains unresolved in a deeper sense, because the word inflammable will always carry with it the logical contradiction that makes no sense to speakers encountering it for the first time, reminding us that language is not a perfectly rational system, but rather a living artifact of historical accident and gradual social negotiation. Consider the sentence, "The horse raced past the barn fell," a construction that momentarily deceives the mind into believing it is grammatically incomplete, leading the reader down a garden path of linguistic assumption before the true structure reveals itself upon reflection. This phenomenon occurs because our brains naturally parse language according to the most statistically probable patterns we have encountered throughout our lives, patterns so deeply ingrained that we apply them automatically without conscious deliberation. And when a sentence begins in a manner that suggests a common structure, our minds commit to that interpretation before we have received enough information to recognize that we have been led astray. The mechanism at work here involves what neuroscientists and linguists call garden pathing, which describes the moment when our initial syntactic expectations prove incorrect, and we must engage in what is called reanalysis, a process where the brain rewinds its parsing attempt and reconsidering the sentence with fresh interpretive eyes, treating what we believe to be a single clause as actually containing multiple clauses arranged in a less obvious configuration. When we encounter "the horse raced past the barn fell," we instinctively group "raced past the barn" as a complete verb phrase, expecting the sentence to end or continue with additional information about the horse's racing action. Yet the unexpected arrival of the word "fell" forces us to backtrack and recognize that "raced" is actually a reduced relative clause modifying "horse," meaning the sentence should properly be read as "the horse that was raced past the barn fell." A construction grammatically sound but structurally unconventional. What makes garden path sentences particularly fascinating is that they exploit the essential efficiency of human language comprehension, a system that has evolved to process meaning at remarkable speed by relying on probabilistic guessing rather than exhaustive analysis of every possible interpretation. And this same feature that allows us to understand casual conversation without conscious effort becomes the very mechanism that leads us astray when encountering deliberately constructed paradoxes. Despite possessing the cognitive tools necessary to parse these sentences correctly, if we were to slow down and approach them with deliberate analytical rigor, we remain vulnerable to garden pathing because the automatic language comprehension system operates beneath our conscious awareness and does not wait for final confirmation before committing to an interpretation. Yet we continue speaking and writing in ways that occasionally trigger these effects. As though the linguistic community has normalized this quirk as simply another harmless feature of how human communication inevitably functions. Consider the simple sentence, "The horse raced past the barn fell." When you first encounter this statement, your mind rebels against it, searching desperately for meaning in what appears to be a grammatical catastrophe, a sentence that has broken apart mid-thought and scattered its components across your consciousness like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. Yet if you pause and allow your mind to reorganize the words, restructuring them with different emphasis and different meanings, the sentence suddenly crystallizes into perfect clarity. The horse raced past the barn had fallen, or more accurately, the horse that was raced past the barn fell. What appears at first glance to be linguistic chaos is actually a completely valid construction. A garden path sentence that deliberately misleads your brain into pursuing one grammatical interpretation when another, equally legitimate interpretation exists waiting in the wings. This phenomenon occurs because your mind, in its remarkable efficiency, tends to process language through the path of least resistance, automatically assigning the most common and straightforward meaning to each word as it arrives, building a grammatical structure on the fly without pausing to consider alternative interpretations. The word raced, arriving early in the sentence, is immediately understood as a simple past tense verb indicating an action that the horse performed, and this initial parsing locks your attention into a particular trajectory, causing you to anticipate a direct object or prepositional phrase that will complete the horse's action. When the word fell arrives at the sentence's end, it shatters this expectation entirely, creating a momentary cognitive dissonance that forces you to backtrack and reprocess everything you have just heard. Yet this paradox persists in language despite our complete understanding of its mechanics, and despite our ability to recognize it intellectually, because the human brain continues to process language with the same efficient shortcuts that served our ancestors well in real-time conversation, where backtracking and reprocessing would be impractical. We have normalized this quirk of human cognition, accepting that our brains will sometimes lead us astray through the garden paths of language, and we even find a certain pleasure in the sensation of being momentarily confused and then suddenly enlightened, as if our consciousness has performed a small magic trick upon itself. Perhaps this is why garden path sentences persist in our literature and speech, not as errors to be corrected, but as small demonstrations of the mind's flexibility, reminders that meaning is never fixed to the surface of language, but always waiting beneath it, ready to be discovered anew by those patient enough to look again. And indeed, the very sentence that serves as our gateway to understanding this phenomenon, the horse raced past the barn fell, becomes almost a koan of language itself, a statement that teaches us something essential about how we construct meaning. That comprehension is not passive reception, but active creation, a continuous negotiation between what the words say and what our minds expect them to say. Consider the headline that reads, "Drunk gets 9 months in violin case," a phrase that, when encountered in isolation, conjures the absurd image of an intoxicated person somehow fitting inside a musical instrument container and receiving a 9-month sentence for this peculiar transgression. Yet the actual story, buried beneath the syntactical ambiguity, concerns a person convicted of a crime who will spend 9 months in prison, and the violin case is merely incidental detail about what was stolen or involved in the original offense. This phenomenon, known as a crash blossom headline, emerges from the collision between the grammatical structure of a sentence and the human brain's instinctive attempt to parse meaning from limited context. When we read such headlines, our minds perform what linguists call a garden path parsing, where we commit to one interpretation of the sentence structure, travel confidently down that syntactical garden path, and then crash against the realization that our initial reading was grammatically valid but semantically nonsensical, forcing us to backtrack and reconstruct the meaning entirely. The crash blossom headline typically features a noun phrase that can function as either the subject or object of an action, or uses participles and gerunds in ways that create dangerous ambiguity about who is doing what to whom. The term itself derives from a 2006 blog post discussing a headline that read, "Enraged cow injures farmer with axe," which initially suggests a bovine creature wielding a weapon with malicious intent before revealing that the farmer was actually holding the axe. What makes these headlines persist in newspapers and digital media, despite their obvious capacity to confuse, is that they technically violate no rules of English grammar, yet they betray the pragmatic conventions that ordinarily guide headline writing, which should disambiguate and clarify rather than mystify. Editors and writers, racing against deadlines and character limits, sometimes fail to anticipate the alternative readings their compressed language might generate in a reader's mind. And once such a headline exists in the wild, it often circulates for its entertainment value precisely because of its unintended absurdity. We have developed almost a cultural acceptance of these linguistic accidents, sometimes celebrating them online for their accidental humor rather than criticizing them as failures of clear communication, which speaks to how normalized the collision between grammar and sense has become in our media landscape. Yet perhaps this acceptance reflects something deeper about language itself. That meaning is never purely a matter of grammar, but emerges from the constant negotiation between what words technically say and what our experience tells us they should mean, and Crash Blossoms simply expose this gap with unusual clarity and comedy. Consider the experience of standing in a room and saying aloud to another person, "It is raining outside, but I do not believe that it is raining," and notice how profoundly strange this statement feels, not because it is logically contradictory in the way that saying, "It is raining and it is not raining" would be, but because it commits what philosophers call a performative contradiction, where the very act of asserting something undermines the content of what is being asserted, creating a peculiar kind of incoherence that lives not in the realm of pure logic, but rather in the space between what we say and what our saying of it reveals about our actual mental states. The paradox, named after the philosopher G. E. Moore, who first articulated this puzzle in the early 20th century, emerges from the curious fact that while there is nothing strictly logically impossible about the sentence itself, there is something deeply irrational about believing and asserting it, because to assert that it is raining is conventionally understood as expressing a belief that it is raining. And therefore, to simultaneously assert that you do not believe it is raining creates a kind of performative self-sabotage, where the statement becomes pragmatically absurd, even though it remains logically coherent. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is that it reveals something fundamental about the nature of assertion itself, namely that assertion is not merely the expression of a proposition, but is also necessarily an expression of the speaker's commitment to that proposition, so that any statement which divorces the content from the commitment becomes linguistically and psychologically awkward in a way that pure logical contradiction might not. Because a logical contradiction at least obeys the laws of reason even as it violates them, whereas Moore's paradox seems to violate something deeper about how language actually functions as a social and cognitive tool. We find these paradoxes embedded throughout human communication in subtler forms, appearing when someone says, "I'm not a good person, but I believe I'm a good person," or "Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore because it is too crowded," statements that are logically possible but pragmatically incoherent because they undermine their own assertability through the very act of being asserted, and yet we navigate these linguistic minefields constantly without consciously noticing them, suggesting that our minds have evolved sophisticated mechanisms for detecting when the form of an utterance contradicts its content, even when logic alone would permit the statement. This sensitivity to performative contradiction may itself be a form of rationality deeper than formal logic, a kind of pragmatic wisdom that recognizes the difference between what can be true and what can coherently be meant, suggesting that the real structure of human thought is not primarily concerned with avoiding logical impossibilities, but rather with maintaining coherence between our words, our beliefs, and our actions in the intricate social dance of communication. Consider the peculiar linguistic situation that philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine identified, a problem that emerges when we attempt to define words through quotation and reference, creating a sentence that seems to undermine its own meaning through an act of self-reference. The classic formulation presents us with a sentence that reads as follows: "Yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation." When we examine this construction carefully, we find ourselves caught in a logical loop that cannot be resolved through conventional means, because if the sentence is true, then it must be false, yet if it is false, then it must be true, leaving us suspended in a state of perpetual contradiction that defies our fundamental assumptions about language and truth. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the clever manipulation of quotation marks and self-reference, creating a sentence that simultaneously describes itself and performs the very action it describes, much like a hall of mirrors where each reflection contains another reflection that contains yet another, extending infinitely into logical impossibility. Unlike other paradoxes that might be dismissed as mere linguistic tricks or semantic games, Quine's paradox reveals something profound about the nature of language itself and how we use words to refer to words, how quotation functions as a tool for discussing meaning while simultaneously obscuring the very meaning it attempts to clarify. We persist in using language despite this fundamental instability at its core, because in our everyday discourse, we rarely encounter these self-referential situations, and our minds have developed remarkable capacities for overlooking logical contradictions when they do not immediately interfere with communication. The paradox remains embedded in linguistic theory as a permanent reminder that language contains within itself the seeds of its own potential undoing, and yet we continue to write, speak, and understand one another, having normalized this strange coexistence of logical impossibility with practical functionality. Perhaps this acceptance reflects a deeper truth, that language evolved not as a perfectly logical system, but as a flexible instrument for communication among finite minds navigating an uncertain world. And in that context, the paradoxes we encounter are less like fatal flaws and more like the growing pains of a tool that has outgrown its original purposes, forcing us to continually refine our understanding of meaning itself. In this light, Quine's paradox serves not as a dead end, but as a generative problem that has sparked decades of philosophical inquiry into the nature of quotation, self-reference, and the boundaries between language and metalanguage, inviting us to reconsider whether the fault lies in language itself or in our expectations that it should function as a transparent mirror of logical truth. What remains certain is that grappling with such paradoxes strengthens our understanding of how meaning is constructed and negotiated in the spaces between words, speaker, and world. Imagine a philosopher named Stephen Yablo who constructs an infinite sequence of sentences, where each sentence makes a claim about all the sentences that come after it in the list. And in this particular construction, the first sentence states that all of the sentences following it are false. The second sentence claims that all sentences after it are false. The third sentence makes the same assertion about everything that follows, and this pattern continues infinitely without end, creating a self-referential loop that seems to avoid the traditional liar's paradox by never directly referring to itself, but instead always pointing forward to an infinite regress of other statements. The mechanism at work here is that unlike the classical liar's paradox, where a single statement declares itself false, creating an immediate logical contradiction, Yablo's construction appears to distribute the contradiction across an infinite chain of sentences, each one claiming falsehood about everything that comes next, which theoretically should make it less problematic because no sentence directly contradicts itself at a single moment. Yet when we examine this paradox more carefully by considering whether the first sentence is true or false, we find ourselves trapped in the same contradiction that we were trying to avoid, because if the first sentence is true, then all following sentences must be false. But if all following sentences are false, then the first sentence cannot be true, and if the first sentence is false, then at least one sentence following it must be true. Which creates exactly the kind of logical impossibility we encounter in simpler paradoxes. What makes Yablo's paradox particularly fascinating is how it reveals that the infinite regress itself is not actually necessary to create the paradoxical situation, that our intuition about complexity making a problem more solvable or more avoidable is fundamentally mistaken, and that we can construct genuinely problematic logical situations without the obvious self-reference that makes other paradoxes easier to dismiss as mere word games or linguistic tricks. Which means that the nature of logical contradiction runs deeper than our surface-level attempts to avoid it through structural complexity or careful construction. And despite our best efforts to engineer around the problem through abstraction and infinite chains, we discover that paradox seeps through these defenses, persisting in the logical foundations of language and reference itself, with a stubbornness that suggests these puzzles point toward something essential about how meaning works. This insight suggests that paradoxes are not merely logical anomalies to be solved or eliminated, but rather windows into the fundamental limits of formal systems themselves, reminders that any sufficiently rich language capable of self-reference and quantification will inevitably harbor contradictions that no amount of careful rule-making can completely suppress. Consider a self-referential sentence that states something along the lines of, "If this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists," or more formally, "If this sentence is true, then X is the case," where X represents any arbitrary claim whatsoever, whether mundane or absurd. This is the essence of Curry's paradox, named after the logician Haskell Curry, who identified this peculiar linguistic trap that seems to prove anything can be true simply through the structure of language itself. The paradox operates by creating a sentence that refers to itself while making a conditional statement, and when you follow the logical chain through to its conclusion, you arrive at the deeply unsettling realization that you can prove literally anything is true using this method, which should be entirely impossible if language and logic are functioning properly. The mechanism behind this paradox involves a kind of bootstrapping effect where the sentence's reference to its own truth value creates a loop that feeds back into itself, allowing us to derive conclusions that have no connection whatsoever to the initial claim, meaning that through pure logical manipulation, we could ostensibly prove that purple elephants invented calculus or that the moon is made of cheese, simply by constructing the right self-referential conditional statement. What makes Curry's paradox particularly troubling compared to other logical paradoxes is that it does not rely on negation or contradiction in the way that the liar's paradox does, but instead uses the innocent-seeming structure of simple conditional reasoning to generate its impossible conclusions. The paradox persists in philosophical discourse despite our sophisticated understanding of formal logic, because it reveals something fundamental about the gap between how language naturally operates and how formally rigorous logical systems must operate to avoid falling into these traps. We have largely normalized this paradox by restricting it to academic discussions and formal logic courses, treating it as an interesting mathematical curiosity rather than acknowledging that it demonstrates a genuine limitation in how we use conditional statements within self-referential contexts. The existence of Curry's paradox suggests that there are structural features of language itself that make certain combinations of words genuinely problematic, not because they violate grammar or common sense, but because they interact with the mechanisms of reference and truth in ways that our intuitive understanding of logic simply cannot accommodate. This recognition invites us to ask whether the fault lies in language itself, in our logical systems, or in our assumption that truth and reference can operate transparently without careful restriction, a question that remains unresolved in contemporary philosophy of language and continues to shape how logicians design formal systems to avoid such self-defeating loops. Imagine standing before an enormous pile of sand on a beach, and consider the question of when exactly a collection of grains becomes something we would call a heap. If you remove a single grain from the pile, you are left with what is still undeniably a heap of sand, because one grain cannot possibly make the difference between something being a heap and not being a heap. Now remove another grain, and again you have a heap, because removing one grain from a heap cannot logically result in it no longer being a heap. Continue this process indefinitely, removing one grain at a time, and by this logic, you should still have a heap even when only a single grain of sand remains on the beach. Yet clearly, a single grain of sand is not a heap. This is the Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, and it reveals a fundamental tension between how we use language and how logic operates in the physical world. The paradox emerges because our ordinary language relies on vague predicates, words like heap, bald, tall, or rich that do not have sharp, clearly defined boundaries in reality. We know intuitively what a heap looks like and what it does not, yet we cannot specify with absolute precision the exact moment at which something transitions from being a non-heap into being a heap, or from not being bald into being bald. This vagueness is not a defect in language, but rather a feature that allows us to communicate efficiently in a world of continuous gradations and subtle differences. The logical mechanism that makes this paradox so troubling is the principle of bivalence combined with the closure of logical operations under our linguistic assumptions. We assume that any predicate is either true or false with no middle ground, and we assume that small, incremental changes cannot produce large categorical shifts. Both assumptions seem reasonable in isolation, yet they lead us into contradiction when applied together to vague concepts. Our minds struggle with this paradox because we are caught between two competing ways of understanding the world: the classical logic that demands clear yes or no answers, and the empirical reality of nature that presents us with continuous spectra and gradations. We have normalized this tension by simply accepting that language is approximate and that vagueness is an inescapable part of human communication. We navigate daily life without knowing exactly how many grains constitute a heap, how many hairs must be lost to be bald, or at what precise income level someone becomes wealthy, and this acceptance allows us to function despite the paradox lurking beneath the surface of our words. Yet this pragmatic acceptance masks a deeper question. If we cannot draw a line between heap and non-heap, between bald and not bald, then perhaps these categories are not discoverable features of reality, but rather useful fictions we impose upon it, concepts we create rather than find, shaped by our needs and interests rather than by nature itself. Consider the curious situation where law enforcement officers must police the police who police the police, a recursive and self-referential structure that emerges naturally within hierarchical systems tasked with maintaining order and accountability. In real departments across the world, police officers are supervised by senior police officers, who are themselves overseen by even higher-ranking police officers, creating layers of internal policing where each level is responsible for ensuring that the level below it adheres to regulations, ethical standards, and legal protocols. When a police officer commits misconduct, it falls to other police officers to investigate, and when those investigating officers act improperly, it becomes necessary for additional police officers to examine their conduct, and this process can continue indefinitely, spiraling into seemingly endless chains of authority reviewing authority. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests on a fundamental logical paradox, the question of who watches the watchers, a problem that philosophers and administrators have grappled with for centuries. An external body could theoretically solve this issue, but external oversight bodies are often staffed by former police officers or individuals embedded within the same institutional culture, creating the illusion of separation while maintaining internal accountability that circles back to the institution itself. We have normalized this recursive structure despite its inherent contradiction because we have built our understanding of order around the assumption that authority can be self-correcting, that systems designed to police behavior can simultaneously police themselves without fundamental bias or self-interest interfering with the process. The language itself, repeating the word police 4 times in sequence, captures something essential about how deeply embedded this concept has become in our organizational thinking, how we accept without question that the solution to police misconduct is more police oversight, a response that satisfies our need to believe in accountability while potentially avoiding deeper systemic examination. Yet this recursive loop reveals itself most starkly when we consider that true accountability might require stepping outside the system entirely, not adding another layer of police to oversee the existing layers, but fundamentally reconsidering whether the institution itself possesses the structural capacity for genuine self-correction, or whether certain problems are simply too embedded within the system's foundation to be solved from within. This paradox becomes especially acute when we consider historical examples. The internal affairs divisions that failed to act on widespread corruption in major cities, or the oversight boards composed entirely of former officers who shared institutional loyalties with those they were meant to scrutinize, suggesting that the recursive structure itself may be the problem rather than its solution. Consider the sentence structure that emerges when we examine a student's written work, perhaps an essay about a historical figure or a past event, and we find ourselves writing a correction in the margins that reads, "The student had had a clear understanding of the material, but had had difficulty expressing it coherently." This construction, while grammatically valid and technically correct according to the rules of English, creates a linguistic phenomenon so unusual that it borders on the absurd, yet it represents a legitimate application of past perfect tense doubling that English grammar permits without objection. The mechanism that allows this to occur exists because English distinguishes between the simple past tense, indicating an action completed at a specific time, and the past perfect tense, which indicates an action completed before another past action. And when these temporal relationships nest within each other across multiple clauses, the word had must appear in succession to maintain grammatical accuracy. What makes this particularly intriguing is that our brains register the repetition as peculiar, almost like a phonetic stuttering, even though we can parse the meaning if we slow down and consider each instance individually, with the first, had serving as the auxiliary verb for the past perfect of the main clause, and the second, had beginning the past perfect construction of a subordinate clause. The persistence of this construct in English despite its awkwardness reflects something fundamental about how language evolves, for we do not simplify or eliminate such patterns because they serve a genuine communicative purpose, maintaining the temporal precision that allows us to distinguish between layers of pastness, between what had happened before other things happened. We have simply accepted that English will sometimes require us to articulate sentences that sound almost like linguistic accidents, and we have normalized the discomfort by treating these moments as technical curiosities rather than flaws in our system. acknowledging that clarity and grammatical correctness can occasionally produce results that feel unnatural to the ear. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this phenomenon is that we encounter it most vividly in the very act of correcting or explaining language itself, as when a teacher observes that the student had had problems with grammar, creating a recursive loop where the awkwardness of the construction becomes inseparable from discussions about the student's struggles with language precision, making the sentence itself a living demonstration of the challenge it describes. In this way, the sentence becomes a mirror held up to the very phenomenon it examines, a self-referential moment where grammar and meaning collapse into one another, reminding us that language is not merely a tool for describing reality, but sometimes a participant in that reality, subject to the same recursive patterns and nested complexities that characterize human thought itself. The quadruple had stands as a testament to this peculiar truth, that our most precise utterances can simultaneously be our most bewildering ones. Consider a sentence that appears to describe a simple past tense narrative, but instead creates a temporal and grammatical paradox that confounds our linguistic expectations. James, while John had the better result. This construction, which has circulated through linguistics courses and internet forums for decades, represents a fascinating breakdown of how our brains process language when traditional grammatical rules are stretched to their absolute limits. In the real situation this sentence attempts to describe, we might imagine two students, James and John, who each completed an assignment. And when we compare their work, James's submission appears superior compared to what John had previously submitted in an earlier assignment. The mechanism behind this linguistic puzzle operates on the principle of homonymic saturation, where the word had functions simultaneously as an auxiliary verb, a main verb, and a temporal marker, repeating so many times that our cognitive processing system becomes overwhelmed and unable to parse meaning from the accumulated phonetic units. When we encounter this sentence in its written form, our brain initially attempts to apply standard grammatical rules, searching for subject-verb agreement and logical temporal relationships, but instead finds itself caught in an infinite loop of near-identical morphemes that refuse to resolve into coherent meaning. The psychological phenomenon at work here involves what linguists call garden path sentences taken to an extreme, where our expectations are violated so consistently and so thoroughly that we cannot recover our footing within the sentence structure itself. Despite the fact that this sentence technically obeys certain grammatical rules regarding the formation of past perfect tenses through repeated auxiliary verbs, it remains fundamentally unusable in any practical communication because the cognitive load required to process it exceeds what our working memory can reasonably manage. We have normalized these paradoxes in academic and online communities as intellectual curiosities precisely because they demonstrate both the flexibility and the fragility of human language processing, revealing that our linguistic competence has hidden limits that can be exposed through systematic repetition and structural manipulation. The sentence thus serves as a mirror reflecting back to us the artificial boundaries between what language can theoretically express and what it can practically communicate, reminding us that grammar is ultimately a tool designed for human comprehension rather than a system to be pushed toward its breaking point. In this way, James, while John had the better result, becomes less a failure of English and more a testament to the remarkable efficiency of our everyday linguistic intuitions, which silently filter out such constructions long before they reach our conscious awareness. Consider the sentence, "The house that the architect that the city hired designed collapsed." When you encounter this structure, your mind begins parsing the initial clause with confidence. But as additional nested clauses insert themselves deeper into the center of the sentence, your cognitive load increases exponentially, and by the time you reach the final verb, the original subject and its relationship to that verb have become so distant and obscured that comprehension begins to deteriorate into genuine confusion. This phenomenon, called center embedding, demonstrates a peculiar limitation in human language processing, where our brains struggle to maintain syntactic coherence when relative clauses nest within relative clauses within relative clauses, creating a recursive depth that exceeds our working memory capacity. The psychological mechanism underlying this collapse operates through the constraints of human short-term memory, which can typically hold only 4 to 7 distinct information units simultaneously, and when a sentence forces you to suspend multiple incomplete thoughts while waiting for nested structures to resolve, you eventually run out of mental workspace. The paradox becomes apparent when you realize that these sentences are technically grammatical, perfectly valid, according to the formal rules of English syntax, and yet they remain fundamentally incomprehensible to native speakers despite their complete linguistic legitimacy. We have organized our entire spoken and written communication system around structures that our own brains cannot reliably process when pushed to their formal limits, yet we continue speaking and writing as though this contradiction does not exist. Language has evolved to prioritize meaning transfer over perfect grammatical compliance, allowing speakers to intuitively avoid these embedding patterns in natural conversation. And yet the potential for such constructions remains embedded within the rules themselves, a latent flaw that reveals how our linguistic competence diverges profoundly from our linguistic performance. This gap between what we theoretically can construct and what we practically can parse suggests that human language operates not as a perfect formal system, but as a biological technology optimized for real-time communication under the constraints of embodied cognition, where evolutionary pressures favored rapid, shallow processing over grammatical purity. The sentence structures we actually use in daily life, shorter, simpler, with pauses and reformulations, reveal our implicit understanding of these cognitive boundaries, an intuitive grammar that respects the limits of the mind even as the explicit rules of syntax do not. When you listen to someone speak spontaneously, you hear this intuitive grammar at work. Speakers break sentences into smaller units, insert clarifying pauses, repeat subjects to reset memory, and consciously avoid the very nesting patterns that syntax permits, demonstrating that true linguistic mastery lies not in constructing grammatically perfect sentences, but in knowing which perfect constructions to reject. Consider the peculiar experience of standing in a room with three identical glasses of water, each one presented to you in a different context, and yet your mind insists on ranking them according to invisible criteria that have nothing to do with the water itself. The first glass sits on a marble countertop in an expensive restaurant, and your brain immediately assigns it qualities of purity and refinement, even though you know intellectually that the water came from the same municipal source as the second glass, which rests on a plastic table at a gas station convenience store. The third glass, held in your own hand at home, registers somewhere in the middle of your internal hierarchy, not because the water differs, but because comparison itself has become a tool your mind uses to construct meaning where none objectively exists. This phenomenon, rooted in what psychologists call contextual relativity and comparative judgment, reveals something profound about how we process information. We do not evaluate things in isolation, but rather through the distorting lens of their surroundings and the associations we attach to those surroundings. Our brains have become sophisticated machines for detecting difference, for ranking, for establishing hierarchies, and this ability once served us well when we needed to distinguish between safe and unsafe water sources or fertile and barren land. Yet in our modern world, this comparative mechanism fires constantly, creating illusions of difference where none exists, making us believe that identical experiences are somehow fundamentally altered by the frame in which they appear. We know this is happening, we understand the mechanism, and yet we remain powerless to stop it, continuing to assign value and meaning based on comparison rather than intrinsic quality, normalizing this distortion so completely that we have forgotten it is a distortion at all. The restaurant water tastes better not because it is better, but because we have learned to taste with our eyes and ears first, the soft clink of glass, the attentive server, the ambient murmur of wealth, allowing these sensory props to rewire our perception of a molecule that remains chemically unchanged. In this way, comparative illusions do not merely distort our judgment, they actively construct the reality we experience, making the frame not just a lens through which we see the world, but a fundamental ingredient of the world itself. And perhaps this is why we find ourselves perpetually dissatisfied even when our circumstances objectively improve. Because the comparative illusion moves with us, always finding new frames, new hierarchies, new invisible criteria by which to measure our experience as somehow inadequate relative to some other version we might have lived instead. The hedonic treadmill becomes not merely a return to baseline satisfaction, but a perpetual recalibration of the frame itself, we acquire the marble countertop, only to find ourselves comparing it to someone else's granite, the illusion intact and insatiable. Consider a sentence like "The garden gate, beautiful and weathered, stood silent against the autumn wind," and then imagine it stripped down to its skeletal form. The garden gate stood silent. Now imagine someone presenting you with a sentence fragment that reads, "The garden gate, beautiful and weathered against the autumn wind," and asks you to read it aloud naturally, without hesitation or stumbling. Your mind will automatically supply the missing verb, inserting "stood" into the space where it belongs, even though the word never appears in the written text itself. This is the missing verb illusion, a peculiar phenomenon where our brains complete grammatically incomplete sentences so seamlessly that we often fail to notice the structural violation until someone explicitly points it out to us. The mechanism behind this illusion operates through our deeply ingrained pattern recognition systems, which have been trained through years of reading and listening to recognize the underlying logical structure of language, regardless of whether every single component has been literally provided. When we encounter a noun phrase followed by descriptive modifiers and prepositional phrases, our linguistic processing system immediately recognizes the semantic intent and fills in the grammatical skeleton with the most contextually appropriate verb, allowing us to experience the sentence as complete even when it technically remains broken. We have become so accustomed to this automatic completion process that it now functions almost invisibly, operating in the background of our consciousness like a powerful autocorrect system built directly into our neural language centers. The paradox deepens when we consider that this illusion persists even among people who are consciously aware that it is occurring, suggesting that our automatic linguistic repair mechanisms operate beneath the level of voluntary control, executing their corrections before our conscious analytical mind has a chance to evaluate whether a correction was truly necessary. This automatic completion becomes particularly striking when we examine sentences designed specifically to exploit this tendency, such as "The horse raced past the barn fell," where our initial parsing attempt, supplying a direct object after "raced," leads us astray, forcing a conscious recalibration that can feel almost jarring once we recognize the actual grammatical structure. In these moments of correction, we glimpse the extraordinary sophistication of our linguistic machinery, which operates most invisibly precisely when everything proceeds without friction. Yet the illusion reveals something profound about language itself. It is not merely a system of symbols to be decoded, but a collaborative act between speaker and listener, writer and reader, where meaning emerges from the interplay between what is explicitly stated and what our minds eagerly reconstruct, suggesting that perfect completeness in language may be neither possible nor necessary. Imagine standing in ancient Crete, listening to a man named Epimenides make a simple declaration about the nature of his own people, a statement so straightforward in its construction that it seems almost mundane at first glance, yet one that would echo through thousands of years of philosophical discourse and become the foundation upon which entire logical systems would be tested and questioned. Epimenides, a Cretan philosopher, stood among his contemporaries and announced to the world that all Cretans are liars, a claim that immediately collapses into profound paradox the moment we consider that he himself is a Cretan, and therefore, by his own assertion, a liar as well. If his statement is true, then it must be false, because he is a Cretan making a truthful claim which contradicts the claim itself. Yet if his statement is false, then not all Cretans are liars, which means some speak the truth, and his statement could be among those truths, creating an endless loop of logical recursion that refuses to settle into any stable interpretation. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the nature of self-reference and the peculiar way that our minds struggle to process statements that turn inward upon themselves, creating what philosophers call a performative contradiction, where the act of uttering the statement simultaneously undermines its own truth value in a way that simple external statements never could. Our brains have evolved to process information hierarchically, to distinguish between the speaker and the subject of speech, between the observer and the observed, yet this statement violently collapses those necessary distinctions by making the speaker both the observer and the observed, the judge and the judged, forcing our rational apparatus to confront its own fundamental limitations. What makes this paradox so peculiarly persistent throughout human history is precisely that we have never quite managed to dismiss it as merely a clever word game or a meaningless linguistic trick. despite the fact that formal logic has developed ways to work around it, and language philosophers have proposed solutions that seem to defang its power, yet still we find ourselves drawn back to it. Still fascinated by how something so elegantly simple can generate such profound confusion and uncertainty about the nature of truth itself. Perhaps this is why the paradox has survived so robustly across centuries, not despite our logical advances, but because it touches something deeper than mere syntax, revealing that the human mind's capacity to recognize truth may itself depend upon frameworks and assumptions that are fundamentally unprovable, leaving us forever caught between the desire to escape the paradox and the suspicion that escape may itself be impossible. The paradox thus serves as a mirror held up to the limits of reason itself, revealing that some of our most fundamental tools for understanding reality, logic, language, self-awareness, contain within them the seeds of their own undoing, suggesting that truth may ultimately be less a destination we can definitively reach and more a horizon that recedes precisely as we approach it. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a river in ancient times, facing a crocodile that speaks to you with human language and poses a question that will determine your fate. The crocodile says, "I am going to eat you. If you can guess correctly whether I will eat you or not, I will let you go free. If you guess incorrectly, I will eat you." This scenario, known as the Crocodile Dilemma, creates a logical paradox that has puzzled philosophers and logicians for thousands of years, originating from ancient Greek sophistic traditions and persisting through medieval scholasticism into modern philosophical discourse. The mechanism of the paradox operates through a self-referential loop that defies binary resolution, for if you guess that the crocodile will eat you and your guess is correct, then the crocodile must release you according to its own promise, which makes your prediction false. Conversely, if you guess that the crocodile will release you and your guess is correct, then the crocodile must eat you to honor its agreement, which renders your correct guess simultaneously incorrect. The psychological weight of this dilemma lies in our deep expectation that language and logic must always produce determinate outcomes, that every statement must be either true or false, and that promises made must be kept according to their explicit terms. What renders this paradox particularly fascinating is that despite its logical circularity and the absence of any actual crocodiles that speak human language or honor philosophical agreements, we continue to find it compelling and worthy of serious intellectual engagement. We have normalized the study of impossible scenarios because they reveal the hidden assumptions embedded within our reasoning systems, exposing the fragile boundaries between language, logic, and reality that we construct without questioning them in ordinary discourse. In this way, the crocodile dilemma functions as a mirror held up to language itself, revealing that our most fundamental tool for understanding reality contains within it the seeds of paradox and undecidability. By engaging with such impossible scenarios, we train ourselves to recognize that logic is not a perfect map of reality, but rather a human invention with inherent limitations, a humbling realization that has shaped philosophy from Aristotle's discussions of the liar's paradox to contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and machine reasoning. Yet perhaps the deepest insight the crocodile dilemma offers is that such paradoxes need not be obstacles to understanding. They can instead be invitations to expand our logical frameworks, to recognize that some situations demand not a single answer, but a recalibration of the very questions we ask. When we encounter the crocodile's question, we might realize that the only genuine escape lies not in finding the correct answer within the paradox's terms, but in stepping outside its framework entirely, recognizing that some promises are inherently impossible to keep, and that acknowledging this impossibility is itself a form of wisdom rather than defeat. In a small town, there exists a barber who has established a simple rule for his profession. He shaves every man who does not shave himself, and he shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. This rule seems straightforward enough on the surface, a practical arrangement for dividing labor in a community where some men prefer professional grooming while others maintain their own facial hair. The barber becomes a necessary figure in the social fabric, offering his services to those unable or unwilling to perform this task themselves, creating what appears to be a perfectly logical system of categorization. However, when we examine this rule more carefully, we encounter a question that seems simple yet contains within it a logical impossibility that has captivated philosophers and mathematicians for generations. Does the barber shave himself? If the barber shaves himself, then according to the rule, he must be a man who shaves himself, which means he falls outside the category of men who do not shave themselves, and therefore he should not shave himself according to his own rule. Yet if the barber does not shave himself, then he must be a man who does not shave himself, and by his own stated rule, he must shave himself, which creates the opposite contradiction. This circular logic presents what logicians call a self-referential paradox, where the very act of applying the rule to the rule maker produces an outcome that violates the premise from which it originated. The barber cannot exist as described without creating an internal contradiction that no amount of practical reasoning can resolve, because the definition of the barber's profession contains within it the seeds of its own logical impossibility. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it reveals the fragile nature of systems that attempt to categorize everything within their scope, especially when those systems must apply to themselves. In our everyday thinking, we rarely encounter such explicit contradictions because we accept implicit exceptions and undefined boundaries without scrutiny. We create rules, professions, and classifications that function adequately in practice precisely because we do not subject them to such rigorous logical analysis. The Barber Paradox persists not because it describes an actual problem that society has failed to solve, but because it demonstrates that certain kinds of self-referential definitions are fundamentally flawed at a conceptual level, revealing the limitations of formal logic when it attempts to create closed systems that must account for all possibilities within their own framework. This insight connects to deeper questions in mathematics and philosophy. Bertrand Russell's formulation of this paradox helped expose contradictions in early set theory, forcing mathematicians to develop more sophisticated frameworks that could accommodate self-reference without collapse, ultimately reshaping our understanding of what logical systems can and cannot achieve. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of recursive acronyms, where an acronym's expansion contains the acronym itself, creating a loop that feeds back into its own definition in a way that seems to violate the very purpose acronyms were designed to serve. The most famous example exists in the computing world. GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix, a self-referential definition that immediately requires you to know what GNU means in order to understand what GNU means, establishing a circular dependency that demands resolution through outside knowledge rather than through the acronym's own expansion. Similarly, PHP, the widely used programming language, originally stood for Personal Home Page, but was later redefined as PHP, Hypertext Preprocessor, creating a recursive structure where the first letter of the expansion refers back to the complete acronym itself. These linguistic constructs exist throughout technical communities and software development, where engineers have deliberately and playfully created these self-referential definitions, seemingly aware of their logical impossibility, yet embracing them nonetheless. The psychological mechanism that allows recursive acronyms to persist rests on the understanding that acronyms function primarily as memorable labels rather than as true definitions. And once a term has become established enough in a community's vocabulary, the expansion becomes almost irrelevant, serving as a kind of linguistic inside joke rather than as a genuine explanation of meaning. What makes recursive acronyms particularly fascinating is that they represent a complete inversion of how language is supposed to function according to our standard expectations. They transform what should be a simple substitution tool into something self-aware and paradoxical. Yet despite containing a logical contradiction at their very core, these recursive definitions have become normalized within technical communities, where they persist not because they solve any communicative problem, but because they have become so established in common usage that challenging their legitimacy would seem pedantic. Demonstrating how human beings are willing to accept and perpetuate linguistic structures that contain fundamental logical flaws, as long as those structures serve social functions and establish group identity. In this way, recursive acronyms reveal something profound about how language actually works in practice. Meaning is not purely derived from formal definitions, but emerges from shared understanding and repeated use within communities, making the logical structure of a definition almost secondary to its social acceptance and utility. This principle extends beyond mere technical jargon. It suggests that recursive acronyms are ultimately self-fulfilling prophecies, where the acronym's validity becomes strengthened by the very act of its repeated use, creating a bootstrapping effect where community acceptance transforms logical inconsistency into linguistic legitimacy, making the acronym's recursive nature not a flaw to be corrected, but rather an emergent feature of how living language evolves. Imagine a word that exists first as a simple sequence of letters, standing alone as a standalone term, and then, years or even decades later, someone decides to retroactively assign it a meaning by creating a phrase where each letter represents a different word, transforming the original acronym into something that was never intended to be an acronym at all. This phenomenon is known as a backronym, and it represents one of the most peculiar inversions of how language typically develops. Consider the word radar, which began as a technical term that people simply used and understood, but was eventually reverse-engineered into standing for radio detection and ranging, a phrase that perfectly described what the technology actually did. Similarly, scuba emerged as a word in its own right before someone constructed the phrase self-contained underwater breathing apparatus to match its letters, retroactively justifying the term through an invented expansion. The psychological mechanism at work here is our human tendency to impose meaning and order onto patterns we encounter, even when those patterns emerged through pure chance or administrative necessity. When we encounter an acronym that seems to fit perfectly with a concept or technology, our brains automatically assume there must be intentional design behind it, that someone must have carefully crafted this sequence of letters to create a memorable abbreviation. This assumption feels so natural that we rarely question whether the expansion actually came first or whether it was invented after the fact. What makes backronyms particularly fascinating from a linguistic perspective is that they exist in direct violation of how acronyms are supposed to work, yet we have accepted them so completely into our language that most people never realize they represent a fundamental reversal of linguistic intent. We have normalized a process that is essentially archaeology in reverse, where we dig backward through time to construct imaginary histories for words that never had those intentions in the first place. And this strange phenomenon persists not because it serves any practical purpose, but because it satisfies our deep-seated need for things to make sense and for everything in language to have a reason for existing. Yet perhaps this reveals something deeper about language itself, that it is not merely a system we inherit and use, but rather a living canvas onto which we constantly project meaning, reshaping the past to align with the present, and in doing so, we transform arbitrary sequences of letters into narratives that feel as inevitable as if they had been planned all along. Perhaps this is why backronyms feel so satisfying when we discover them. They offer us the comforting illusion that language operates under rational design, that every word carries within it a kind of intentional blueprint, when in reality, the most memorable terms in our vocabulary often arrive through accident, adoption, and our subsequent need to retroactively make them meaningful. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of autological words, those rare linguistic entities that possess the very property they describe, existing as a kind of linguistic mirror in which language describes itself with perfect accuracy. The word short, for instance, contains only 5 letters and is therefore genuinely short in length, making it a word that embodies its own meaning in the most literal sense imaginable. Similarly, the word noun is itself a noun, functioning as a perfect example of the category it names, while the word English is written in the English language and therefore describes itself with absolute precision. These words create a strange loop within language itself, where the signifier and the signified collapse into one another, and the boundary between what a word means and what a word is becomes entirely blurred and indistinguishable. The phenomenon emerges naturally from the structure of language, because words are ultimately just collections of sounds or symbols that have been assigned meanings by human convention and agreement over time. When the property that a word describes happens to apply to the physical or categorical characteristics of the word itself, an autological relationship forms spontaneously, without any intentional design or planning on anyone's part. What makes this genuinely fascinating is how our minds process this peculiar self-reference, requiring us to hold 2 levels of linguistic meaning simultaneously in our consciousness. The definition of the word and the material instantiation of the word as a physical or categorical thing. Yet despite the elegant logic underlying autological words, we rarely acknowledge their existence in everyday conversation or formal grammar instruction, treating them as curiosities rather than recognizing them as fundamental examples of how language can fold back upon itself in ways that are mathematically elegant and psychologically unsettling. The persistence of our casual indifference to autological words suggests something profound about human consciousness, namely that we have an extraordinary ability to overlook logical patterns that exist right before our eyes, preferring instead to maintain our comfortable, linear understanding of how meaning works in language. Perhaps this blind spot itself deserves examination. We have become so accustomed to treating words as transparent vessels for meaning that we have lost the ability to see them as objects worthy of study in their own right, forgetting that language is simultaneously both a tool for describing reality and a reality that can be described, a duality that autological words force us to confront with unavoidable clarity. In this sense, autological words function as linguistic koan, paradoxes that resist easy resolution and demand that we suspend our ordinary ways of thinking about meaning itself. The word polysyllabic, despite describing words with many syllables, contains 5 syllables and thus contradicts its own definition, reminding us that the boundary between autological and heterological words is far more permeable and unstable than we might initially suppose. Consider the peculiar experience of encountering a sentence that reads identically forward and backward, such as a man, a plan, a canal, Panama, or never odd or even, where the very structure of language folds back upon itself in a way that defies our ordinary expectations of how words should move through time and meaning. These palindromic constructions exist in a strange liminal space within English, neither fully natural nor entirely artificial, demanding that speakers and readers navigate layers of linguistic constraint that would typically be considered counterproductive to clear communication. In real-life situations, palindromic sentences appear in word games, crossword puzzles, creative writing challenges, and online communities dedicated to linguistic playfulness, where people spend considerable time and mental effort crafting or discovering sentences that maintain this bilateral symmetry. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with palindromic sentences seems rooted in our brain's deep appreciation for pattern recognition and mathematical elegance, the same neurological systems that find satisfaction in symmetry, recursion, and self-referential structures throughout nature and design. When we encounter a palindrome, our minds experience a peculiar cognitive pleasure, because the sentence simultaneously violates our expectations about language progression while also demonstrating absolute structural perfection, creating a tension between chaos and order that our brains find inherently rewarding. Furthermore, palindromic sentences often require ignoring spacing and punctuation entirely, which reveals how much of our linguistic understanding depends on conventions we typically take for granted, conventions that seem essential until we deliberately set them aside for the sake of pattern. Despite having no practical utility in everyday communication, despite actually obscuring clarity rather than enhancing it, palindromic sentences have persisted in human culture for centuries, suggesting that our attraction to language extends far beyond its communicative function into realms of pure intellectual play and aesthetic appreciation. We have normalized this apparent waste of linguistic resources by elevating it to the status of art and puzzle, valuing the ingenuity required to construct a perfect palindrome even when the result communicates nothing efficiently. Yet perhaps this very inefficiency is the point. In a world where language is constantly weaponized for persuasion and profit, the palindrome stands as a rare linguistic act of pure creation, a sentence that exists only because it can, a monument to the human capacity to find meaning and beauty in constraint itself, to play with the very tools we depend upon for survival. In this sense, the palindrome becomes a kind of linguistic meditation, a deliberate slowing down that forces us to attend to each letter and sound with an almost sacred attention, transforming the act of reading itself into a conscious, almost ceremonial experience rather than the automatic processing we typically employ. Consider the curious linguistic phenomenon known as semordnilaps, which are words that form entirely different and legitimate words when spelled backwards, creating a mirror image of meaning and sound that exists suspended between two distinct concepts. When you take the word desserts and reverse it to reveal stressed, or examine how live becomes evil, or notice that drawer transforms into reward, you encounter a peculiar intersection where language behaves like a perfectly symmetrical hall of mirrors, each word containing its own inverse encoded within its letters. These backward words are not mere accidents of spelling or random coincidences scattered throughout the English language. Rather, they represent a specific category that linguists have identified and named with the very semordnilap of the word, palindromes, creating a self-referential joke at the heart of the term itself. The mechanism that produces these reversals operates through the inherent structure of the alphabet itself, where each letter maintains its visual and phonetic identity regardless of direction, allowing sequences of letters to generate meaning in both directions when the spelling patterns align in just the right configuration. What makes semordnilaps particularly fascinating is that they seem to suggest some deeper intentionality in language, as if words were designed with secret backward meanings waiting to be discovered. Yet this perception of design is entirely illusory, born from our pattern-seeking brains finding meaning in randomness. We have normalized this linguistic oddity by incorporating it into word games, puzzles, and recreational linguistics, treating these backward words as delightful curiosities rather than genuine anomalies. And in doing so, we have domesticated what ought to feel strange about a system where stressed and desserts maintain this eerie symmetrical relationship. Yet perhaps this domestication itself reveals something profound, that we are drawn to semordnilaps not because they represent hidden design, but because they offer us a rare moment where language appears to contain secret knowledge about itself, where the forward and backward directions of meaning seem to whisper that every word might harbor an alternate self waiting in the shadows of its spelling. In this sense, semordnilaps become a mirror held up to language itself, reflecting back our fundamental need to find order and meaning even in linguistic accidents, reminding us that sometimes the most profound truths about how we communicate emerge not from intentional design, but from the playful intersections where randomness and structure momentarily align in ways that feel almost purposeful. And perhaps it is this very quality, the sensation of discovering hidden symmetry in plain sight, that explains why semordnilaps capture our imagination more readily than other wordplay. They offer the illusion of having decoded something secret about language itself, even though we are merely witnessing the mathematical consequence of reversible letter sequences, a reminder that meaning and accident are sometimes indistinguishable twins. Imagine you are listening to a song on the radio, perhaps one you have heard 100 times before, and suddenly your brain crystallizes around a particular mishearing of the lyrics that seems so perfectly reasonable, so linguistically plausible, that you become entirely convinced this is what the artist actually intended to sing. You might hear blinded by the light as blinded by the fright, or mistake the chorus of Concrete Jungle, where dreams are made of, for something entirely different because the phonetic properties of the words, when filtered through your auditory expectations and the limitations of speaker quality or background noise, construct a completely different semantic meaning that your mind seizes upon and refuses to release. This phenomenon is called a mondegreen, a term coined by writer Sylvia Wright in 1954 when she misheard the Scottish ballad The Bonnie Earl o' Moray for decades, believing the lyrics included a woman named Lady Mondegreen when the actual words were simply and land down. The mechanism at work here involves the brain's extraordinary predictive capacity, its tendency to fill in gaps in auditory information by drawing upon its vast repository of known words, cultural references, and linguistic patterns, creating what seems like a perfectly coherent alternative that requires no cognitive friction whatsoever. Your mind is not making an error in the traditional sense. Rather, it is doing precisely what it evolved to do, which is to construct meaning from incomplete or ambiguous sensory input by applying statistical probability and pattern recognition. What makes mondegreens particularly fascinating is how they persist even after correction, even after you have read the actual lyrics or heard someone explain the true words to you, because the misheard version has become neurologically embedded, has taken root in the same neural pathways where genuine memories live, making it nearly impossible to unhear what you have once heard so clearly, suggesting that language itself is not as fixed or objective as we assume it to be, but rather a collaborative construction between the speaker's intention and the listener's interpretation, a space where meaning can genuinely fork into multiple simultaneous realities within the landscape of individual human consciousness. This explains why mondegreens are not merely personal quirks, but windows into the fundamental architecture of how we process language, revealing that hearing is as much an act of creation as it is of reception, and that the correct lyric exists in a kind of quantum superposition with the misheard version until we consciously collapse it into a single meaning, if we ever do at all. And perhaps this is why mondegreens feel less like mistakes and more like discoveries, why we defend them so passionately, why certain mishearings become shared cultural phenomena that spread virally across communities, because they represent a kind of creative collaboration between artist and listener that neither party consciously intended, yet both somehow validate through the very act of transmission and retelling. An eggcorn is a particular type of linguistic error where someone mishears or misinterprets a word or phrase, and in the process of reinterpreting it, creates a new expression that is phonetically similar to the original but semantically completely different, yet somehow oddly logical in its own peculiar way. The term itself originated from a specific example where someone wrote the word acorn as eggcorn, having reanalyzed the sound to fit a pattern that made intuitive sense within their own linguistic framework, combining the concept of an egg with a corn-like object to describe the small, rounded seed of an oak tree. When you encounter eggcorns in real conversation or written communication, you discover a fascinating window into how the human mind processes language when working with incomplete information or unfamiliar terminology. Someone might say for all intensive purposes instead of for all intents and purposes, or dog-eat-dog world instead of dog-eat-dog world, or nip it in the butt rather than nip it in the bud. And in each case, the substituted phrase carries its own internal logic that makes it seem entirely reasonable to the speaker. The psychological mechanism driving these errors stems from our brain's powerful tendency to pattern match and fill in gaps using what linguists call reanalysis, where unfamiliar or rarely heard phrases get reconstructed by our minds using more common, recognizable words that sound approximately similar, and that possess meanings which seem to fit the context of what we believe we are trying to communicate. What makes eggcorns particularly interesting is that they are not merely random mistakes or simple mispronunciations, but rather creative reinterpretations that demonstrate how our minds build meaning from sound, seeking coherence and logic even when processing language we have encountered only passively or peripherally. Despite their lack of actual logical connection to their original phrases, eggcorns often persist for years or even indefinitely within a speaker's personal lexicon, becoming deeply embedded in memory and usage patterns, and they frequently spread to others through oral transmission, creating small linguistic communities that have collectively adopted these alternative expressions as though they were the legitimate originals. The phenomenon persists partly because context usually makes the intended meaning perfectly clear to listeners, partly because correction often feels pedantic or unnecessarily critical, and partly because once an eggcorn becomes familiar to us, our minds essentially accept it as a valid variant, no longer triggering the cognitive alarm that might flag it as an error worth investigating or correcting. Over time, eggcorns reveal something profound about language itself, that it is not a fixed, rigid system handed down from on high, but rather a living, evolving organism shaped by the creative interpretations and unconscious innovations of millions of speakers, each of whom is simultaneously a custodian and an inadvertent architect of linguistic change. Consider the moment when someone, in the midst of casual conversation, substitutes a word they meant to say with another word that sounds similar but carries an entirely different meaning, creating an unintended comedy of errors that would be impossible if language functioned according to purely logical principles. A person might say they need to escape goat instead of scapegoat, or refer to a mute point when they mean a moot point, or declare that someone has deep-seated issues rather than deep-seated ones, and in each instance, the speaker genuinely believes they have selected the correct word, confident in their expression despite the semantic displacement that has occurred. The psychological mechanism underlying malapropisms emerges from the brain's word retrieval system, which prioritizes phonetic similarity over semantic accuracy when accessing vocabulary from memory under real-time conversational pressure, causing the speaker to pull a wrong word from their mental lexicon based primarily on how it sounds rather than what it actually means. This process reveals that our brains are fundamentally organized around sound patterns and frequency of exposure rather than logical meaning, suggesting that we navigate language more through auditory and associative pathways than through rational semantic selection. What makes malapropisms particularly revealing as a linguistic paradox is that they persist even among educated speakers, and even when the incorrect word carries wildly different implications. indicating that our language production system prioritizes speed and phonetic matching over accuracy or meaning verification. Yet we continue speaking fluently despite this fundamental unreliability built into how we retrieve and produce words. We have normalized this constant background error rate in human speech, accepting that miscommunication through word substitution is an inevitable and almost endearing aspect of how humans actually speak, rather than demanding that our brains function with the precision we might expect from a logical system designed to transmit accurate information. Yet this acceptance of linguistic imprecision paradoxically enables the flexibility and creativity that make language resilient. The same neural systems that generate malapropisms also allow us to understand novel metaphors, coinages, and poetic associations that strict logical rules would prohibit, suggesting that the error rate built into human speech may be inseparable from language's capacity to evolve, adapt, and express meaning in ways that transcend literal definitions. In this sense, malapropisms are not merely failures of communication, but rather visible traces of how human cognition actually works, prioritizing connection and approximation over perfection. And they remind us that language was never designed as a transmission system for pure information, but rather evolved as a tool for social bonding, creative expression, and the collaborative meaning-making that occurs when two minds encounter each other's imperfect utterances and somehow, despite the errors. Understand. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room, listening to a respected figure of authority, perhaps a clergyman at a podium or a professor addressing a crowded lecture hall, when suddenly their tongue seems to tangle itself in the most peculiar way, and what emerges from their mouth is something entirely unexpected. Were they intended to say, "You have hissed all my mystery lectures," what actually comes out is, "You have missed all my history lectures," the initial consonant sounds somehow swapping places with one another, as if the mind's careful instructions to the mouth had been scrambled at the last possible moment. This phenomenon, known as a spoonerism, named after Reverend William Archibald Spooner, who was famously prone to such verbal transpositions, represents a fascinating window into how our brains organize and execute the complex motor movements required for speech. The mechanism underlying these errors involves what linguists call phonological encoding, a process occurring deep within the neural regions responsible for language production, where the brain must simultaneously plan the sounds needed for an entire utterance, while also coordinating the precise muscular movements of the lips, tongue, teeth, and vocal cords. When this intricate system experiences what researchers believe to be a temporary malfunction or interference, perhaps due to competing thoughts, divided attention, fatigue, or the sheer speed at which we attempt to convert our ideas into sound, the sounds destined for different positions within the utterance can become transposed, creating these remarkably consistent and often humorous errors. What makes spoonerisms particularly intriguing is that they follow discernible patterns rather than occurring randomly, suggesting that the brain actively organizes phonetic information in structured ways during speech planning, and that errors reveal the underlying architecture of this system. Despite our modern understanding of how language production works, and despite the obvious illogicality of these verbal slips that serve no communicative purpose whatsoever, spoonerisms continue to occur regularly in the speech of virtually every human being, persisting as an inevitable byproduct of the remarkable speed and complexity with which we operate our linguistic faculties. Yet perhaps this very inevitability reveals something profound about the nature of human communication itself, that our words emerge not from perfect, mechanical precision, but from the messy, dynamic interplay of competing neural processes, making these slips not failures of our linguistic system, but rather glimpses into its true operational reality. In this light, the occasional blushing crow, instead of crushing blow, or a toast to the Lord that becomes a Lord's toad, transforms from embarrassing mishap into something closer to an honest reflection of consciousness itself. A reminder that beneath the polished surface of human speech lies an astonishingly complex organism, perpetually negotiating between intention and execution, thought and sound, perfection and the beautiful imperfection that makes us human. A paraprostokion is a sentence or phrase that leads your mind down one grammatical path, fully committing you to an expected conclusion, only to abruptly pivot at the very end with an unexpected word or phrase that completely reframes everything you thought you were hearing, forcing your brain to rewire its interpretation retroactively, and often producing an effect of humor or surprise through this linguistic misdirection. Consider the classic example, I have had a perfectly wonderful evening, but this wasn't it, where you anticipate a statement of contentment until the final clause inverts the entire meaning, or the statement time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana, where the first phrase establishes one grammatical structure that you then expect to repeat. But instead the second clause uses the same words in an entirely different syntactical arrangement. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally rooted in how human brains process language through prediction and pattern recognition, wherein your mind is constantly generating hypotheses about what word will come next based on context, syntax, and semantic probability. So when a paraprostokian deliberately violates these expectations at the last possible moment, it creates a peculiar cognitive dissonance that requires you to rapidly reparse the entire sentence structure and reassign grammatical roles to words you had already mentally cataloged. What makes paraprostokians particularly fascinating is that they operate within perfectly legitimate rules of grammar and syntax, yet they feel like rule-breaking because they exploit the predictive nature of human comprehension itself, taking advantage of the fact that we do not typically process language word by word in isolation, but rather construct meaning probabilistically and recursively, building scaffolds of understanding that we then have to dismantle and reconstruct when the final word arrives. These constructions have persisted in human communication for centuries, appearing in literature, comedy, and everyday speech, suggesting that despite our growing awareness of how they function, there remains something deeply satisfying about experiencing this cognitive reversal, as though the surprise itself carries value independent of its logical or communicative function. And we continue to construct and appreciate paraprostokians not because they serve essential communicative purposes, but because the peculiar sensation of mental reorganization they produce feels inherently rewarding to our language processing systems. This neurological satisfaction may explain why paraprostokians have become a staple of wit and social bonding, functioning as a kind of intellectual play that demonstrates both linguistic flexibility and creative thinking, so that appreciating or crafting a paraprostokian becomes a way of signaling cognitive agility and shared understanding of how language can be artfully bent without breaking. Consider the moment when a speaker or writer constructs a sentence that appears grammatically sound on the surface, yet violates the fundamental rules of how language should function by applying a single word to multiple parts of a sentence in ways that are logically incompatible with each other, such as when Charles Dickens wrote that Miss Bolo went down to posterity with a calmness of deportment and a bustle, where the word went technically applies to both posterity and to her physical movements simultaneously, creating a collision between literal and figurative meaning that somehow makes perfect sense to our ears despite being fundamentally impossible. This phenomenon, known as zeugma, represents a peculiar violation of linguistic rules where one word or phrase is forced to carry multiple grammatical or semantic functions that ought to require different forms entirely. Yet our brains, remarkably adapted to finding meaning in ambiguity, accept it as eloquent rather than erroneous. The psychological mechanism that allows zeugma to function rests upon our mind's extraordinary flexibility in processing language. When we encounter a word doing double duty in this impossible way, we do not reject it as nonsensical, but instead perform instantaneous mental recalibration, stretching the word's meaning or application to fit both contexts simultaneously, treating semantic incompatibility as a form of clever wordplay rather than linguistic failure. The mechanism operates because human language comprehension is fundamentally generative and creative. We do not process language through rigid rule-checking alone, but through a constant negotiation between what the rules say and what makes sense within context, social convention, and artistic intention. What persists most strikingly about zeugma is how thoroughly we have normalized this logical impossibility into something not only acceptable but celebrated, teaching it in schools as a literary device worthy of admiration rather than correction, demonstrating that language has always been less a system of absolute rules and more a collaborative agreement between speakers to accept useful exceptions whenever they serve expression better than strict adherence ever could. In this way, zeugma reveals something profound about language itself. That grammar is not a prison but a playground, and that the most memorable utterances often arrive precisely at those moments when we bend the rules just enough to make them sing. When we say someone lost their temper and their keys, forcing a single verb to bridge the trivial and the emotional, reminding us that meaning lives not in strict compliance, but but in the spaces between what words literally say and what they manage to make us feel. Consider the moment when you encounter a phrase that contains two words in direct contradiction with one another, words that should logically cancel each other out entirely, yet somehow they persist together in our everyday language without causing the speaker or listener any sense of distress or confusion. An oxymoron is a linguistic construction where opposing or mutually exclusive concepts are deliberately joined together, creating a statement that appears nonsensical on its surface, and yet we use these combinations repeatedly without hesitation. Think of the common examples that surround us: deafening silence, bittersweet emotion, living dead, jumbo shrimp, pretty ugly, cruel kindness, or the phrase controlled chaos that so many workplaces describe themselves by. Each of these pairings brings together two ideas that fundamentally contradict one another, concepts that should not be able to coexist in the same logical space, yet here they are, woven into the fabric of how we communicate with complete normalcy. The psychological mechanism at work here is that the human mind is extraordinarily adept at holding multiple contradictory concepts simultaneously and creating new meaning from their collision. When we encounter an oxymoron, our brain does not simply reject it as impossible, but rather expands our understanding of both words involved, finding a tertiary meaning that lies precisely in the tension between the two opposing terms. A deafening silence is not truly loud, nor is it the absence of sound in any objective sense, but rather it describes a psychological state of such profound quiet that it becomes overwhelming, that the absence itself becomes an overwhelming presence. This linguistic flexibility reveals something fundamental about how language actually works, which is that words do not have fixed, unchangeable definitions locked away in some eternal dictionary, but rather their meanings are fluid and contextual, shaped by the intentions of speakers and the interpretive capacity of listeners. We have normalized oxymorons not because we have somehow resolved the logical contradiction they contain, but because we have come to understand that language often functions through paradox and multiplicity, that meaning emerges not from logical consistency, but from the rich interplay of contrasting ideas. The oxymoron persists because it actually captures certain truths about human experience more accurately than straightforward language could ever manage. When we describe a friend as a serious joke, or acknowledge that someone possesses quiet confidence, we are articulating nuances of personality and emotion that would require entire paragraphs to explain through literal language alone. The oxymoron, then, is not a failure of language, but rather one of its greatest triumphs, a proof that human expression thrives precisely in those spaces where logic breaks down and paradox becomes the most honest form of truth. We might even say that oxymorons are the linguistic equivalent of how we actually live our lives, navigating contradictions between our desires and our circumstances, our public selves and our private thoughts, always somehow making sense of what logic insists should be impossible. Picture yourself in a conversation where someone tells you they saw something with their own eyes, or they heard it with their own ears, or perhaps they climbed up the stairs to reach the second floor above them. And in that moment you encounter one of language's most peculiar redundancies. The pleonasm, a figure of speech where we use more words than logically necessary to convey a single meaning, adding descriptive language that repeats information already contained within the primary word itself. When someone describes a situation as a true fact, or mentions they will return back to a place they came from, or describes something as being absolutely essential, they are engaging in this linguistic phenomenon where the additional modifiers seem to serve no practical purpose beyond what the original word already communicates. The mechanism behind pleonasm operates through our natural tendency to emphasize and reinforce meaning through accumulation and redundancy, a psychological impulse that emerges from our desire to ensure our message lands with maximum clarity and emotional weight, as though saying something twice might somehow make it more true or more real in the listener's mind. We layer these unnecessary descriptors onto our core concepts because we unconsciously feel that a single word might lack sufficient persuasive power, that the bare noun or verb requires ornamentation and reinforcement to truly convince those who hear us. And this reflects a deeper anxiety about whether our words alone possess adequate force to communicate what we intend. Despite the fact that pleonasm violates the principle of linguistic efficiency, adding nothing but redundancy to our expressions, we have not only normalized this practice but elevated it to an accepted feature of natural speech, where phrases like free gift, unexpected surprise, or past history pass through conversation without raising any eyebrows or causing any confusion. suggesting that language operates less as a system of pure logic and more as a system governed by psychological comfort and the ritualistic reinforcement of meaning through beautiful, unnecessary repetition. And perhaps this reveals something essential about human communication itself, that we do not speak merely to transfer information, but to create a shared experience of meaning-making, where the redundancy becomes a kind of linguistic ritual that binds speaker and listener in mutual understanding, transforming efficiency into intimacy. In this light, the pleonasm becomes less a failure of language and more a feature of it, a reminder that when we speak, we are not always trying to be efficient, but rather trying to be heard, trying to ensure that across the gap between one mind and another, our meaning arrives not just intact, but resonant with the emotional truth we feel. The redundancy of "I saw it with my own eyes" becomes then not a logical flaw but an act of vulnerability, a speaker leaning forward and saying, "In effect, I was there, I witnessed this myself, believe me asterisk," transforming what might seem like careless speech into an implicit plea for connection and credibility that pure efficiency could never quite achieve. Consider the moment when someone says that what will be, or that boys will be boys, or that a rose is a rose, and notice how these statements seem to carry weight and wisdom despite containing no new information whatsoever. A tautology is a sentence that is necessarily true by virtue of its logical structure alone, a statement so perfectly circular in its construction that it cannot possibly be false. Yet we encounter these linguistic formations constantly in everyday speech, in motivational contexts, in philosophical discussions, and even in moments where we seek comfort or explanation. When a parent tells a child that the early bird gets the worm, or when we hear that it is what it is, we are experiencing a kind of linguistic loop that begins and ends at precisely the same point, delivering us back exactly where we started without having traveled anywhere at all. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of tautologies appears to be rooted in our deep need for certainty and reassurance, for statements that cannot be challenged or contradicted because they are irrefutable by their very nature. And this unfalsifiable quality creates a strange sense of security in a world that feels increasingly uncertain and chaotic. Our brains seem to interpret the definitional inevitability of tautologies as a form of profound truth, as though repetition and circularity somehow equal wisdom, when in fact they merely equal themselves with perfect precision. We have normalized these statements to such an extent that they function as cultural placeholders, allowing us to acknowledge difficult situations without actually having to explain or solve them, and they persist in our language despite offering no logical reason for their existence beyond their psychological comfort and their rhetorical closure. The phenomenon suggests that humans are willing to embrace statements that are logically empty if they are emotionally or socially satisfying, and we have built entire frameworks of conventional wisdom around these circular truths. Perhaps this reveals something essential about language itself, that its power lies not always in its capacity to inform, but in its ability to create the illusion of understanding, to offer us the comfort of closure even when we stand before genuine mysteries that resist rational explanation. When we say that time heals all wounds, or that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, we are invoking these circular truths precisely when our rational minds have exhausted their explanatory resources, transforming linguistic emptiness into a kind of existential scaffolding upon which we can temporarily rest our anxieties. And yet this very mechanism, our willingness to find solace in circular logic, demonstrates that the human need for meaning often supersedes the human need for information, that we are creatures who will accept the comfort of a closed loop over the discomfort of an open question, suggesting that tautologies persist not as failures of language, but as features of it, tools we have unconsciously refined to soothe ourselves when reality exceeds our capacity to comprehend it. Consider the paradox that emerges when you find yourself applying for a job that requires experience you can only gain by working that very job, a circular requirement that traps you before you even begin, much like the military pilot in the classic novel who cannot be grounded for insanity, because the act of flying dangerous missions while mentally unstable is itself proof of sanity, since only a sane person would recognize the danger and want to escape it. The logic operates as a self-defeating mechanism where the solution to your problem is simultaneously the proof that you do not qualify for that solution, creating an inescapable loop that feeds upon itself with relentless precision. In employment markets, organizations demand that junior candidates possess years of professional experience, yet those same organizations are the only entities that could have provided such experience in the first place. And so the aspiring worker finds themselves locked outside a door that only opens from the inside. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves the displacement of responsibility onto an abstract system, allowing institutions and gatekeepers to claim they are merely following objective standards while remaining blind to the impossibility they have created. What makes Catch-22 logic particularly insidious is that it presents itself as reasonable and necessary, wrapped in the language of professional standards and competitive advantage, when in reality it functions as a self-perpetuating barrier that protects existing power structures from disruption. We have normalized these circular requirements across countless domains, from healthcare licensing that demands practical experience before allowing practitioners to gain practical experience, to housing markets where building credit requires having credit, to educational systems that penalize students for not understanding concepts before they have been taught. The trap persists because those already inside the system benefit from its maintenance, and because we have collectively accepted the invisible logic that says some things simply cannot be helped, that paradoxes are unfortunate but inevitable features of how the world operates rather than choices made by human beings who could choose differently. Yet the paradox dissolves the moment we recognize it as a choice rather than a law of nature, the moment a hiring manager decides to train a promising junior candidate, or a licensing board creates an apprenticeship pathway, or a credit union offers a first loan to someone with no history, the circle breaks. What appeared inevitable reveals itself as merely convenient for those in power. The question then becomes not whether these systems can change, but why we continue to accept the fiction that they must remain as they are, and what courage it takes for those with the power to break the cycle to actually do so, knowing that dismantling such barriers threatens the very advantages that gatekeeping was designed to protect. Consider the employee who is told by their manager that they must be both independent and collaborative, that they should take initiative without overstepping boundaries, that they need to speak up about problems while also maintaining team harmony and not being difficult or disruptive. Consider the child told by a parent that they are free to make their own choices, yet every choice they make is met with criticism or correction or disappointment. Consider the person in a relationship told they must be authentic and honest while simultaneously being informed that certain truths, when spoken, will damage the relationship irreparably. These are double binds, situations where an individual receives two or more contradictory messages or demands simultaneously, where compliance with one requirement necessitates violation of another, creating an impossible logical position from which there is no escape. The mechanism operates through a peculiar inversion of clarity. The contradictory messages are often delivered with equal weight and urgency, making it impossible to prioritize one without betraying the other. What makes the double bind so psychologically potent is that it creates a state of perpetual self-scrutiny and hesitation, where every action becomes suspect because any action will inevitably violate one of the competing demands. The person caught within it cannot simply acknowledge the contradiction and opt out, because the very nature of the binding often involves an implicit threat or withdrawal of affection or approval should they refuse to participate in the impossible task. We have normalized double binds throughout our social structures so thoroughly that they often remain invisible, operating as background radiation in families, workplaces, and institutions. We accept that growth requires comfort, that ambition must remain humble, that we should be ourselves while conforming to standards, creating linguistic and psychological spaces where people must constantly contort themselves to satisfy contradictory imperatives that were never meant to be simultaneously satisfiable in the first place. The result is a kind of psychological exhaustion that masquerades as personal failure. We internalize the contradiction as evidence of our own inadequacy rather than recognizing it as a structural impossibility, and in doing so, we become complicit in our own binding, reinforcing the system that traps us by assuming the fault lies within ourselves rather than within the logic of the demands themselves. The cruelest aspect of this mechanism is that it rewards those who suffer silently and efficiently within it, who internalize the contradiction without complaint, who learn to navigate the impossible with grace and self-blame, creating a perverse incentive structure where recognizing the bind as external and structural becomes itself a form of insubordination. a refusal to gracefully bear what you are told, is simply the burden of maturity. Consider the peculiar linguistic situation that emerges when we attempt to speak about a monarch who currently holds the throne in a country that no longer has a reigning sovereign, or when we reference historical figures using present-tense language despite their having lived centuries in the past. When we say the present King of France, we invoke a description that points to something that does not exist in our current reality, yet the phrase itself is grammatically constructed as though it refers to an actual entity that we could locate and identify if we simply looked hard enough. The statement operates within perfectly acceptable English syntax, its words arranged in a logical order that would typically guarantee meaningful reference, and yet it fails fundamentally in its primary function because France has no king to present to us. This creates a strange linguistic vertigo where our language performs the act of reference while simultaneously referring to nothing whatsoever, a ghost word pretending to have substance. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals something deep about how human language functions, because we construct descriptions that function like pointing gestures, like our words are fingers indicating a specific location in the world where something exists. When that something does not exist, we find ourselves in an unusual epistemological position where grammatical correctness becomes divorced from meaningful truth, where a sentence can be perfectly well formed while being completely empty of actual reference. We persist in using such descriptions despite their fundamental emptiness because language evolved as a tool for navigating a world of actual things, and we have become so accustomed to the structure of descriptive phrases that we often fail to notice when they fail to hook onto reality. The present King of France continues to haunt our conversations as a reminder that language is fundamentally a game we have agreed to play, and that game sometimes produces sentences that sound meaningful while describing absolutely nothing at all. Yet this peculiar emptiness is not merely a logical curiosity. It reveals how we navigate the boundary between what exists and what we imagine, between the real and the possible, and how our minds construct meaning even in the face of absence. In this way, the present King of France becomes less a philosophical puzzle and more a mirror reflecting back to us the strange architecture of human thought itself, showing us that our ability to conceive of non-existent things may be as fundamental to cognition as our ability to perceive what actually stands before us. Consider how this capacity extends beyond mere curiosity. We use non-existent reference to explore possibilities, to warn ourselves of dangers that might emerge, to construct elaborate ethical and political thought experiments that guide our actual decisions in the real world. The present King of France, in his very impossibility, becomes a tool for thinking itself. We construct elaborate hypotheticals about monarchs who never were, about political systems that never existed, and in doing so we expand the boundaries of what we can think about and ultimately what we can become. Consider the peculiar linguistic phenomenon wherein we assign names to concepts, places, or entities that possess no actual referent in reality, yet we continue to use these names with complete confidence and grammatical precision, as though the thing they represent genuinely exists. A classic example emerges in our casual references to fictional locations that have become so embedded in our cultural consciousness that we speak of them with the same certainty we would use for real cities, treating Santa's workshop or Atlantis as legitimate geographical reference points in conversation, complete with directional instructions and historical narratives that we construct with astonishing detail and collective agreement. The mechanism behind this phenomenon rests upon humanity's remarkable capacity for what philosophers call intentionality, the ability of our minds to direct attention toward and create meaningful reference to things that exist only in the sphere of imagination, collective agreement, or abstraction. When we hear the name, our brains activate the same neural pathways that would activate for actual places, conjuring vivid mental imagery and emotional responses despite the complete absence of any concrete external object these names refer to. The truly peculiar aspect of this linguistic behavior is how seamlessly we navigate between reference that exist and those that do not, how we employ the same grammatical structures, the same tone of voice, the same confidence for both categories without experiencing any cognitive dissonance or linguistic friction that might otherwise alert us to the strangeness of what we are doing. We have normalized this practice so thoroughly that to question it feels almost pedantic, almost absurd, Yet beneath this normalization lies a fundamental paradox about how language actually works, suggesting that names need not correspond to anything real in order to function perfectly well as names, and that our minds have become so skilled at collective make-believe that we have essentially built an entire parallel universe of meaning that runs alongside our actual one. This capacity extends beyond mere entertainment or cultural tradition. It becomes the very foundation upon which entire systems of value, belief, and social organization rest, from the concept of justice itself to the notion of a nation-state, each existing primarily through our collective agreement to treat these empty names as though they possess substance and consequence in the real world. Yet perhaps the most unsettling recognition is that we cannot clearly delineate where empty names end and reality begins. For if enough people believe in the power of a currency, a border, or a moral principle, does it not become functionally real, possessing genuine consequences that shape lives as concretely as any physical object? In this sense, the distinction between empty and full names collapses entirely, revealing that reality itself may be far more dependent on our collective naming and believing than we typically acknowledge. Consider the evening star that graces the western horizon just after sunset, that brilliant point of light that ancient astronomers named Hesperus, the evening bearer, a celestial companion to countless civilizations watching the day surrender to darkness. Now consider the morning star that appears in the eastern sky before dawn breaks, that luminous herald of the approaching sun that those same cultures called Phosphorus, the light bringer, a separate and distinct heavenly body in the minds of observers who track the heavens with meticulous care. For thousands of years, these were thought to be two different celestial objects, two separate entities occupying different regions of the sky at different times, deserving of different names and different mythological significance. Yet eventually, through the advancement of astronomical knowledge and careful observation, humanity discovered an extraordinary truth. Hesperus and Phosphorus are not two separate stars at all, but rather the same celestial body, the planet Venus, appearing in different positions in our sky depending on its orbital relationship to Earth and the Sun. The paradox that emerges from this discovery operates on a fundamental level of language and identity because we have two names, two distinct linguistic labels, each with its own history and cultural weight, referring to a single object that has never changed its essential nature. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profound about how knowledge acquisition and linguistic convention interact in human consciousness. When we learned facts about Hesperus and facts about Phosphorus, we encoded them into our minds as separate pieces of information attached to separate words, and this categorical separation felt justified by observation and experience, since we never saw both lights in the sky simultaneously. Our language organized reality into distinct boxes, and for centuries this organization felt perfectly adequate, perfectly true, perfectly aligned with what our senses told us about the world. Only when we gained the capacity to track planetary motion and understand orbital mechanics did we realize that our linguistic categories had failed to capture the actual structure of reality, that two names were describing one phenomenon all along. Yet what remains philosophically unsettling is not merely the discovery itself, but the way it persists as a demonstration of language's fundamental limitation, that the same thing can have multiple true descriptions, that identity itself becomes slippery when we examine it closely, that names and categories can be perfectly functional and yet simultaneously reveal their inadequacy to capture what actually exists. We have normalized this paradox almost entirely, treating it now as merely an interesting historical footnote rather than as a continuing challenge to how we organize our understanding through language, when in fact it points to an endless possibility that other elements of our conceptual framework might contain similar hidden identities waiting for future knowledge to expose. Consider the evening star and the morning star, two celestial bodies that appear in the sky at different times, separated by the apparent arc of the sun's movement through our atmosphere. For centuries, ancient astronomers and casual observers treated these as distinct objects, separate phenomena in the cosmos worthy of different names and different attention. The evening star would appear in the western sky after sunset, a brilliant beacon marking the transition from day to night, while the morning star would emerge in the eastern sky before dawn, a herald of the approaching sun. These 2 points of light seemed fundamentally different in their nature and timing, yet they occupied different conceptual categories in human awareness and language. Then came the realization the moment when scientific observation revealed what now seems obvious. Both the evening star and the morning star are Venus, the same planet, the identical celestial body viewed from Earth at different points in our planetary orbit. Here emerges the philosophical puzzle that has troubled logicians and philosophers for over a century, ever since the German mathematician and philosopher Gottlob Frege formalized the problem in his work on meaning and reference. If the evening star and the morning star are genuinely identical, if they refer to the very same object in reality, then why do the two statements, the evening star is Venus, and the morning star is Venus, not seem to convey equivalent information? Why does one statement feel informative while the other might feel redundant? The mechanism underlying this puzzle operates through the distinction between what something is and how we know what it is, between reference and sense, between the object itself and the conceptual path we take to arrive at that object. Two names or descriptions can point to the exact same entity in the world, yet they can carry vastly different cognitive pathways, different historical contexts, different associations, and learned patterns. When we learn that the evening star is Venus, we experience a genuine discovery, a synthesis of previously separated concepts, yet when we hear that the morning star is Venus, we might wonder whether this constitutes new information or mere repetition. The puzzle persists in our thinking even now, despite centuries of understanding the physical reality, because language and cognition are not purely about what exists in objective reality, but about how human minds navigate, categorize, and relate to that reality through symbolic systems that carry the weight of discovery, surprise, and individual perspective. This insight reveals something profound about the nature of meaning itself. Our words do not merely label fixed points in reality, but rather serve as windows into the complex architecture of human understanding, where the same truth can be approached through infinitely different doors, each one opening onto a slightly different landscape of significance and surprise. Consider the peculiar sentence that has long fascinated linguists and philosophers alike. A farmer owns a donkey and he beats it. In everyday conversation, we understand this phrase with remarkable ease, knowing instinctively that he refers to the farmer and it refers to the donkey. Yet this sentence presents a profound puzzle to formal logic and semantic theory that remains unresolved despite decades of intense academic scrutiny. The mystery emerges when we attempt to translate this simple statement into the formal language of predicate logic, where we discover that the structure we use intuitively in natural language creates logical contradictions that cannot be adequately represented using standard first-order logic alone. The problem is that the pronoun it appears to refer back to the donkey mentioned earlier, but in formal logic, the donkey exists only within the scope of the existential quantifier from the first clause, and technically that scope should not extend into the second clause where the pronoun appears. What this means is that we have created a linguistic reference that our minds process instantly and without difficulty, yet our most rigorous mathematical systems cannot properly account for or represent without adding layers of additional logical machinery. We navigate these sentences every single day without any conscious awareness whatsoever, casually using pronouns across clauses and sentences in ways that our grammatical intuitions assure us are perfectly coherent, even though the formal representation of that coherence requires extensive theoretical frameworks like dynamic semantics or discourse representation theory. The persistence of donkey sentences in our daily language reveals something curious about human cognition. We are equipped with an implicit understanding of reference and scope that operates beneath the level of conscious reflection, allowing us to parse meaning from structures that our explicit, formalized theories struggle to accommodate. This gap between our practical linguistic competence and our theoretical explanations suggests that language may be fundamentally more sophisticated than our attempts to systematize it, or perhaps that our approach to formalizing meaning has overlooked something essential about how human minds actually construct and maintain coherent discourse across extended stretches of communication. Consider the alternative approach. Perhaps the very act of formalizing language inevitably strips away the contextual, embodied, and pragmatic dimensions that make natural language work, suggesting that donkey sentences are not failures of logic, but rather evidence that human communication operates through a richer system of meaning-making that transcends the boundaries of formal systems altogether. Consider the peculiar linguistic phenomenon known as Bach-Peters sentences, named after the linguists Emil Bach and Stanley Peters, who first documented their remarkable properties in the 1970s. These sentences possess a distinctive characteristic wherein two noun phrases become mutually dependent on one another in a way that creates a circular reference structure that our minds nonetheless manage to process and understand. A classic example emerges when we encounter a sentence such as, "The man who saw the boy who insulted him was tall," where the pronoun him can refer back to either the man or the boy, creating an ambiguity that persists even as we read the words in sequence. What makes these sentences genuinely fascinating is that they demonstrate a fundamental paradox in human language processing. Our brains appear capable of holding multiple contradictory interpretations simultaneously, resolving them through contextual reasoning even when the grammar itself remains deliberately unclear. The psychological mechanism underlying our ability to comprehend Bach-Peters sentences suggests that human language understanding does not operate through simple left-to-right sequential processing, but rather through a more complex system of placeholder assignments and retrospective integration, wherein we hold potential meanings in suspension until additional context allows disambiguation. We are essentially creating multiple parse trees in our minds, multiple possible structural interpretations of the same utterance, and yet we do not experience this as confusing or impossible, but rather as something we can reason through and manage. This capacity reveals something profound about human cognition. That ambiguity itself is not a barrier to comprehension, but rather something we actively resolve through sophisticated mental machinery operating largely outside conscious awareness. Despite the fact that these sentences violate traditional principles of clarity and unambiguous reference, we have developed such robust mechanisms for handling linguistic complexity that Bach-Peters sentences feel merely curious rather than incomprehensible. The persistence of our ability to understand such constructions suggests that language comprehension relies not on simple rule following, but on our extraordinary capacity for contextual inference, pragmatic reasoning, and the simultaneous maintenance of multiple competing interpretations, until resolution becomes possible through the accumulation of additional linguistic and world knowledge. This remarkable flexibility in our linguistic cognition extends beyond mere academic curiosity. It illuminates how we navigate the everyday ambiguities of natural conversation, where speakers routinely rely on listeners' inferential powers to construct meaning from inherently underdetermined utterances, suggesting that Bach-Peters sentences represent not an anomaly, but rather a crystalline distillation of ordinary language comprehension itself. Consider the sentence, "I saw the man with the telescope," a phrase that seems straightforward until you pause to examine what it actually means, for it could describe either a situation in which you observed a man who happened to be carrying a telescope, or alternatively a situation in which you used a telescope as your instrument of vision to observe a man in the distance. And this fundamental uncertainty about which interpretation is correct reveals something profound about how language operates at the intersection of grammar and meaning. The ambiguity arises not from a defect in the sentence itself, but rather from the way that our minds must assign scope to different elements within a grammatical structure, deciding which words modify which other words and in what order the logical operations should be performed, much like mathematical equations where the placement of parentheses determines the outcome of a calculation. When we encounter scope ambiguity in everyday communication, we typically resolve it through context, through the tone of voice of the speaker, through shared knowledge about what makes sense in a given situation, or through the patterns of conversation that have preceded the ambiguous statement. Yet the underlying grammatical structure remains forever capable of multiple interpretations, regardless of how successfully we navigate toward a single intended meaning. This phenomenon persists throughout language in countless variations. The phrase old men and women might refer to men who are old and women who are old, or it might refer to men who are old and women of any age. And similarly, "I don't like this because it's boring" could mean that boredom is the reason for my dislike, or it could express a general statement about why anyone wouldn't like something, with the scope of the negation creating entirely different logical propositions. What makes scope ambiguity particularly fascinating is that it reveals the gap between the surface structure of language and the deep logical meaning that we intend to convey, suggesting that communication succeeds not because our grammatical system is perfectly designed to eliminate ambiguity, but rather because human beings are remarkably skilled at inferring intention and navigating the vast territory of possible interpretations that language permits. We have normalized this fundamental instability in linguistic meaning, accepting that virtually every complex sentence we produce contains potential ambiguities that we simply gloss over through contextual reasoning. And we have developed sophisticated cognitive mechanisms for managing these ambiguities so seamlessly that we rarely notice they exist at all, allowing us to function in a linguistic system that is theoretically far more ambiguous than it needs to be, yet practically effective because of our remarkable capacity for interpretation and inference. Consider the sentence, "I almost fell down the stairs this morning," and notice how the modifier almost seems to attach itself to the verb fell in our minds, creating a sense that the falling itself was nearly completed, when in fact the entire event of falling nearly occurred. This phenomenon, known as squinting modifiers or two-way modifiers, emerges when an adverbial phrase positions itself between two elements in such a way that it remains ambiguous about which one it genuinely modifies, forcing the listener or reader into a kind of interpretive squint. Imagine saying, "She decided yesterday to leave for Paris," where yesterday could theoretically modify either the decision itself or the leaving, and the sentence genuinely permits both readings without offering clear grammatical markers to disambiguate. The mechanism underlying this peculiarity stems from English's relatively flexible word order compared to languages with case systems, combined with our brain's tendency to process modifiers according to proximity and semantic plausibility rather than strict syntactic rules. When we encounter a modifier positioned ambiguously between two possible attachment sites, our neural language processing system evaluates both options simultaneously, weighing semantic fit, temporal logic, and communicative intent in fractions of a second, yet without obvious external markers to guide us definitively toward one interpretation. What makes squinting modifiers particularly fascinating is that they persist in our everyday speech and writing despite being technically ambiguous, and we have largely normalized their existence rather than treating them as genuine errors. We accept them because context usually rescues us, our pragmatic understanding fills the gaps, and most native speakers have internalized the patterns so thoroughly that ambiguity rarely causes genuine miscommunication in practice. This represents a profound acceptance of controlled ambiguity in language, where we have collectively decided that perfect clarity, according to rigid grammatical rules, matters less than communicative efficiency and the natural flow of expression, allowing these squinting modifiers to occupy an unchallenged space within our linguistic ecosystem. Yet this acceptance also reveals something important about the evolution of language itself, that grammar is not a set of immutable laws handed down from on high, but rather a living negotiation between clarity and convenience, where speakers and writers constantly push against rigid boundaries in pursuit of more natural expression, and where the language gradually shifts to accommodate these pushes rather than rigidly rejecting them. The squinting modifier thus serves as a small but illuminating window into how language adapts over time, showing us that ambiguity itself can become a feature rather than a flaw when speakers collectively agree to tolerate it, and that the most resilient aspects of grammar are often those that balance competing demands rather than prioritize absolute precision over all other considerations. Consider the moment when you read a sentence that begins with a descriptive phrase, one that seems to float untethered to any clear subject, creating a strange grammatical phantom that your mind must chase through the remainder of the statement. Picture yourself encountering a sentence such as "Walking through the park, the trees were beautiful," where the opening modifier grammatically attaches itself to the nearest noun, which happens to be the trees, even though the trees were not walking through the park at all. This is the dangling modifier, a construction where a descriptive phrase at the beginning or middle of a sentence modifies a word that is not actually performing the action described, creating a logical impossibility that somehow persists in everyday communication. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on the principle that our brains are extraordinarily forgiving pattern recognition machines, capable of ignoring grammatical violations when context and meaning are sufficiently clear. When we encountered driving down the highway, the sunset was spectacular. We understand immediately that the sunset was not driving, and yet we have become so accustomed to these constructions that we parse the meaning without conscious effort, our minds performing an automatic correction that grammar would never permit. The psychological tolerance for dangling modifiers suggests that human language comprehension operates less on rigid rule-based structures than on pragmatic interpretation, where intention and approximate meaning supersede technical correctness. What persists most remarkably about dangling modifiers is how they flourish in professional writing, academic papers, and published literature despite being explicitly forbidden in every formal grammar guide, demonstrating a curious disconnect between prescriptive rules and actual language practice. We have normalized these logical impossibilities so thoroughly that we rarely notice them, and writers continue to dangle their modifiers with impunity, understanding that their readers will perform the necessary cognitive contortions to extract meaning from sentences where the grammar itself has fundamentally broken down, yet somehow the message arrives intact. Yet perhaps this resilience of dangling modifiers reveals something profound about language itself, that grammar is ultimately a servant to meaning rather than its master, and that the rules we enforce so strictly in classrooms matter far less than the successful transmission of thought from one mind to another, even when the grammatical machinery creaks and bends in the process. Consequently, the most instructive dangling modifiers are often those that create genuine ambiguity or absurdity. Sentences like, having finished the manuscript, the publisher rejected it immediately, where the confusion about who actually completed the work forces us to confront the gap between what was written and what was meant, reminding us that clarity, not mere comprehension, remains the writer's truest obligation. Consider the sentence, "I only have $2, spoken by someone reaching into their pocket to show you the contents, and notice how it transforms into, "I have only $2 when the word repositions itself. Yet both somehow convey a similar meaning, despite the fact that placement in English is supposed to modify the word immediately following it. Creating a linguistic anomaly where the modifier has learned to communicate intent across grammatical distance, like an unspoken agreement between speaker and listener. The phenomenon emerges most clearly when we examine how the word only functions as a semantic constraint, intended to limit or restrict the scope of something, and yet in natural speech, we constantly place it before auxiliary verbs or at the beginning of clauses where, by strict grammatical rules, it should be modifying something entirely different, yet our brains somehow decode the intended meaning without conscious effort. As if language has created a secret tunnel underneath its own structural rules. In the sentence, "I only like chocolate ice cream," the word only technically modifies like, suggesting that all the person does with chocolate ice cream is like it, yet what we actually understand is that chocolate ice cream is the sole flavor the person prefers, requiring us to project the word's meaning forward and backward simultaneously to extract the speaker's true intention. This misplacement occurs because spoken English developed a convenience where only migrates toward the auxiliary verb or toward a position of emphasis in the sentence, prioritizing communicative clarity and natural rhythm over formal grammatical precision, and our minds have become so adapted to this pattern that we barely register the structural violation happening in real time. The persistence of misplaced only reveals something profound about how language actually operates in human discourse, which is far more fluid and negotiable than prescriptive rules suggest, and it demonstrates that grammatical correctness exists somewhere between the written rule book and the lived experience of speakers who have collectively decided that meaning matters more than position, creating a parallel linguistic system where intention supersedes structure. Yet this flexibility also reveals the limits of prescriptive grammar itself, for if speakers across generations consistently place only in ways that contradict the rule book while still achieving perfect mutual understanding, then perhaps the rule was never truly a rule at all, but merely a retrospective attempt to codify patterns that had already evolved beyond the grasp of those trying to systematize them. The question then becomes not whether misplaced only is wrong, but whether our insistence on correcting it serves any purpose beyond maintaining an illusion of linguistic authority, especially when the error has become so normalized that pointing it out feels pedantic rather than clarifying, as if we're enforcing a rule that language itself has already voted to abandon. In many languages and dialects around the world, speakers employ a grammatical structure known as negative concord, wherein multiple negative elements appear within a single clause, yet the sentence retains a single negative meaning rather than creating a logically compounded negation. Consider the English phrase, "I don't want nothing," which most standard grammar rules would suggest should mean that the speaker actually does want something, since two negatives traditionally produce a positive in mathematical logic, and yet the speaker clearly intends to communicate that they want absolutely nothing at all. This phenomenon occurs extensively throughout Romance languages such as Spanish and French, where expressions like no veo nada, meaning no see nothing, or gi ni vois rien, meaning I do not see nothing, are not only grammatically acceptable, but are the standard and expected way of expressing negation in everyday speech. The mechanism underlying this persistent linguistic pattern stems from the human brain's preference for emphatic reinforcement and the principle that negative concepts can be redundantly marked without creating logical contradiction in natural language processing. When speakers use multiple negative markers, they are not performing mathematical operations, but rather layering emphasis onto a single negative assertion, much in the way that repetition and reinforcement serve to strengthen communication and ensure that the listener absorbs the intended meaning with absolute clarity. The psychological function appears to involve a drive towards certainty and completeness in expression, as if one negative marker alone might somehow be insufficient to fully convey the depth and absoluteness of the negation being expressed. Despite centuries of prescriptive grammar teaching that emphasizes the logical incompatibility of double negatives, negative concord persists as a natural feature of human language because it serves communicative purposes that transcend pure logic, fulfilling instead the deeper human need for emphasis, emotional intensity, and unambiguous assertion. This linguistic resilience across diverse languages and cultures suggests that negative concord reflects a fundamental feature of how human minds naturally organize and express negation, one that persists precisely because it works so effectively for communication despite its apparent logical paradox. In this way, negative concord reminds us that language is not primarily a system of formal logic, but rather an evolved tool shaped by the psychological and social needs of its speakers. The study of negative concord thus illuminates a broader truth, that grammatical correctness is ultimately determined not by abstract logical principles, but by the actual patterns of usage that emerge from communities of speakers navigating the complex task of conveying meaning to one another with precision and emotional resonance. When we examine negative concord through this lens, we recognize that speakers of non-standard dialects employing multiple negatives are not making errors, but rather participating in a linguistically coherent system that has persisted because it achieves its communicative goals with remarkable efficiency. Consider the phrase, "I could care less," as it emerges from the mouths of millions of English speakers every single day, uttered with complete confidence and conviction, embedded so deeply into casual conversation that most people never pause to examine what they are actually saying or what logical contradiction lies at its foundation. When someone declares, "I could care less" about something, they are attempting to express supreme indifference, the absolute bottom of the care spectrum, yet the words themselves betray an entirely different meaning that contradicts this intention in the most elegant and absurd way imaginable. The phrase literally states that the speaker possesses some capacity, some remaining threshold, some dormant ability to care even less than they currently do, which paradoxically suggests that they do care at least somewhat, that they have not yet reached the absolute zero point of indifference, and that there remains psychological terrain below their current emotional position where further descent into not caring is still theoretically possible. The original and logically sound version of this expression is "I could not care less," which correctly communicates that the speaker has reached the nadir of caring, that no further reduction in care is mathematically or emotionally possible, that they have achieved the state of caring at its minimum viable level, and that to care even one unit less would be physically and emotionally impossible. Yet through some mysterious process of collective linguistic drift, a process that seems to occur in the margins of language where prescriptive grammar battles descriptive reality, the word "not" has been systematically removed from millions of utterances, transforming a logically sound statement into a statement that technically means the opposite of what the speaker intends to communicate. Linguists and grammar enthusiasts have spent considerable energy documenting and debating this phenomenon, some attributing it to mishearing, others to the natural erosion of meaning through rapid speech, where the not becomes phonetically obscured or compressed, still others suggesting that speakers simply adopt the phrase through cultural osmosis without fully processing its literal denotation, and all the while the phrase continues to spread, continues to be used, continues to be understood in its intended sense, even as it fails to actually convey that sense through proper logical analysis. The remarkable aspect of this particular linguistic paradox is not merely its existence, but its stubborn persistence in the face of complete logical invalidity. The fact that native speakers have collectively agreed to let this phrase mean what they intend it to mean rather than what it literally says. The way that social utility and collective understanding have conspired to overpower dictionary definition and logical consistency, creating a situation where correctness and meaning have diverged into two separate pathways that no longer intersect in any meaningful way. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of skunked terms, where certain words become so thoroughly associated with a single meaning or context that their original, legitimate definitions are almost entirely erased from common usage and collective memory. The word skunk itself provides an excellent example, as it primarily refers to the black and white striped animal known for its defensive spray. Yet the verb form, to skunk someone, has become so dominant in sports and gaming contexts that few people remember or use the original zoological noun with any regularity in conversation. This process occurs gradually and almost invisibly, as new associations attach themselves to existing words through repetition and cultural reinforcement, eventually overshadowing or completely displacing the original meaning until it becomes dormant in everyday speech. When a basketball team defeats another team by an overwhelming margin, we say they have been skunked, and this usage has become so prevalent that the animal connection feels almost accidental or forgotten, like discovering an old layer of paint beneath newer coatings on a wall. The psychological mechanism at work involves the principle of semantic saturation and contextual dominance, wherein repeated exposure to a word in a specific context strengthens that particular neural pathway while simultaneously weakening access to alternative meanings, causing the brain to default to the most frequently encountered definition, while older or less commonly used meanings fade into the background of consciousness. Other examples abound throughout language. The word gay originally meant carefree or lighthearted, yet most contemporary speakers would never think to use it in that sense, and the dominance of its modern meaning is so complete that historical texts reading the term in its original context can feel almost alien to modern readers. The word gay demonstrates how thoroughly a skunked term can be replaced, with such finality that entire generations grow up knowing only the newer definition, and becoming genuinely surprised to learn that the word once carried entirely different connotations. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that these shifts occur not through any formal decision or institutional mandate, but rather through the organic evolution of language and culture, as communities collectively and unconsciously agree to emphasize certain meanings while allowing others to atrophy and fade. We accept these transformations as natural and inevitable, rarely questioning why certain words have become thoroughly colonized by singular meanings, and we continue using them without acknowledging the buried history of their definitions or the cognitive pathways we no longer access when speaking or hearing them in conversation. Yet perhaps this linguistic forgetting serves a purpose, allowing language to remain nimble and responsive to contemporary needs, even as it means we lose touch with the etymological roots and historical resonances that once gave our words their full dimensional richness and connected us to earlier speakers across generations. Consider the peculiar phenomenon of fossil words, those linguistic remnants that persist in our everyday speech despite having lost all connection to their original meaning or purpose, orphaned fragments of etymological history that we continue to invoke without ever questioning their presence or their origins. Take, for instance, the phrase dial a number on a modern touchscreen device where no dial exists, or film a video when we are capturing digital data that contains no photographic film whatsoever, or the practice of hanging up a telephone when no telephone has hung from anything for generations, or even the simple act of rolling down a window in a car equipped with motorized systems that glide with electronic precision. These words and phrases exist as linguistic fossils, preserved in the amber of our collective speech patterns long after the material conditions that birthed them have vanished entirely from the physical world. The psychological mechanism that keeps these words alive operates through a process of semantic decoupling, wherein the words themselves become so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of communication that they transcend any requirement to maintain fidelity to their original reference, becoming instead pure symbols whose connection to their etymological origins has been severed so completely that most speakers remain entirely unaware that such a severing has even occurred. We perpetuate these fossil words because language prioritizes efficiency and familiarity over absolute logical consistency, allowing these anachronistic terms to survive through sheer inertia and the deep neurological grooves carved by repetition and intergenerational transmission. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that despite its illogicality, despite the fact that we could easily create new terminology to match our contemporary technologies and practices, we continue to resurrect these verbal fossils with each utterance, preserving them like insects trapped in resin, neither fully alive within their original context nor genuinely dead and forgotten. Existing instead in a strange liminal space where they function perfectly well as communication, while simultaneously serving as inadvertent reminders of worlds that have ceased to exist. Yet perhaps this linguistic archaeology reveals something deeper about human nature itself, our reluctance to fully abandon the past, our tendency to carry forward the ghosts of previous eras even as we stride into radically transformed circumstances, suggesting that language functions not merely as a tool for present communication, but as a bridge across time, connecting us to the hands and minds that first spoke these words when they meant something entirely different. Consider the word strawberry, that common fruit we encounter in markets and desserts throughout our lives, and notice how it contains within itself a linguistic ghost, a morpheme that no longer makes any logical sense when we examine it closely. The first part of the word straw appears to reference dried grass or hay, yet strawberries have no connection whatsoever to straw in their botanical nature, their growing process, or their physical composition. Similarly, the word gooseberry contains the morpheme goose, an aquatic bird that bears absolutely no relationship to the berry itself, neither in appearance nor in any historical agricultural practice that would explain this peculiar naming convention. These fragments of meaning that persist in our language are called cranberry morphemes, named ironically after cranberries themselves, which similarly contain a mysterious morpheme whose original significance has been completely lost to the passage of time. The cranberry was named by the pilgrims who noticed that the flower of the plant resembled the head of a crane. Thus the original term crane berry eventually compressed into the single word cranberry. Yet most modern speakers have no awareness of this etymological origin and encounter the word as a unified concept entirely divorced from any crane imagery. What makes this linguistic phenomenon so psychologically fascinating is the way our brains process these fossilized word fragments as complete semantic units, assigning them meaning through their current usage context rather than through their constituent morphemes. We do not consciously parse strawberry into straw plus berry and wonder about straw, because language has solidified these combinations into fixed expressions that our minds recognize as atomic wholes rather than as composed parts. The mechanism underlying this persistence involves the fundamental way human memory stores and retrieves language, prioritizing frequency and practical utility over etymological accuracy or logical consistency. As language evolves across generations, the original motivations for particular word formations become obscured, yet the words themselves remain in constant use, their historical meanings calcifying into irrelevance while the modern meanings continue their uninterrupted function in our daily speech. We have normalized these linguistic paradoxes so thoroughly that they require no explanation or justification, existing in that strange space where they are simultaneously senseless and perfectly comprehensible. Consider how the word blackmail contains a morpheme whose original reference to payment in black cattle has vanished entirely, or how the humble Pied Piper's name preserves a now meaningless reference to magpie coloring, yet we deploy these words without pausing to reconstruct their buried histories, content to let them function as opaque tools of communication rather than as transparent windows into the etymological past. Consider the peculiar architecture of human language when we conjugate the verb to be in English, where we encounter a phenomenon so fundamental that we rarely pause to notice its profound irregularity. For when we move through the present tense, we say I am, you are, he is. But when we venture into the past, the entire foundation shifts beneath us and we suddenly declare, I was, you were, he was, and this dramatic transformation represents what linguists call suppletion, which occurs when a word simply abandons its root and adopts an entirely different stem without any morphological warning or logical progression whatsoever. The same bewildering pattern emerges in the verb to go, where we navigate present tense with I go, you go, he goes, only to find ourselves saying I went in past tense, as though the verb has completely reinvented itself, drawing from an entirely separate etymological source that bears no resemblance to its contemporary form, and this occurs not through regular grammatical processes, but through what appears to be linguistic theft from another verb's historical lineage. The psychological mechanism underlying suppletion operates through the sheer frequency and familiarity of these basic verbs, which are used so constantly throughout human speech that they have become resilient to the normal forces of linguistic regularization that would otherwise smooth out irregular conjugations over time, allowing speakers to accept these radical discontinuities because they have heard them so often since childhood that the irregularity becomes invisible. Embedded in the automatic neural pathways we activate when speaking. What makes suppletion particularly fascinating is that despite modern English having developed consistent rules for verb conjugation, adding the past tense marker ed to regular verbs almost universally, these ancient irregular verbs have somehow persisted unchanged across centuries of language evolution, resisting the normalizing pressure that would transform went into goad or was into bead, as children occasionally attempt when learning language but quickly abandon. We have essentially normalized a form of linguistic chaos by making these irregular verbs so culturally embedded, so fundamental to basic communication, that questioning their structure seems almost absurd, yet from a logical standpoint, suppletion represents a genuine violation of the principle that words should maintain consistent roots and follow predictable patterns, a principle that governs nearly every other word in English. Creating islands of absolute irregularity in an otherwise increasingly systematic linguistic landscape. Consider the peculiar linguistic phenomenon where society collectively agrees to replace words that have become too emotionally laden with new, gentler alternatives, only to watch those replacements gradually absorb the same negative connotations of their predecessors, forcing us to invent yet another replacement in an endless cycle of semantic displacement. We began by saying someone was crippled, a word that felt direct and factual, but eventually the term acquired such stigma that we replaced it with disabled, which served adequately until disabled itself became associated with pity and otherness. So we shifted to differently abled, and then to people with disabilities, each iteration attempting to reset the moral and emotional weight we had deposited onto the previous word like accumulated psychological sediment. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through a fundamental principle of human language and culture. The words we use to describe stigmatized groups eventually become infected with the stigma itself, absorbing the negative feelings and associations we harbor toward the condition or group they reference, regardless of how neutral or even positive the word initially seems. When we create a new euphemism, we do so with optimistic intentions, believing that a fresh term will free us from the baggage of the old one. Yet what we fail to recognize is that the euphemism is merely a surface-level intervention that leaves the underlying attitudes, fears, and societal structures completely untouched. We are treating the symptom rather than the disease, addressing the linguistic representation while ignoring the social reality that makes the representation necessary in the first place. And so the wheel turns relentlessly forward. What makes the euphemism treadmill particularly fascinating is how it persists despite our awareness of it, how we continue this exhausting cycle even as we understand intellectually that renaming something does not change what it is. Yet we persist anyway, as though the act of finding a new word might somehow alter the human discomfort that necessitated the replacement in the first place. Perhaps what we are truly seeking through each new euphemism is not linguistic precision, but moral absolution, a way to signal that we are not like those who use the old, offensive terms, that we belong to the enlightened present rather than the benighted past, even as we perpetuate the same underlying discomfort that made those terms offensive in the first place. The tragedy is that each new euphemism becomes a kind of linguistic performance of virtue, allowing us to feel we have addressed an injustice through nomenclature alone, when what actually requires our attention is the dismantling of the discriminatory structures and attitudes that made the original term carry such weight. Yet because renaming is infinitely easier than genuine social change, we will almost certainly choose the treadmill again. Consider the curious experience of standing in a room where someone has just said something that perfectly captures a feeling you've had countless times, yet you've never had a word for it, and in that moment, you realize there exists no single word in your entire language to describe this emotion or experience with precision. This phenomenon is called a lexical gap, and it represents those frustrating voids in our vocabulary where language simply fails to provide us with the linguistic tools we need. Perhaps you've felt the specific melancholy of watching someone leave a place for the last time, knowing you'll never see it again in quite the same way, or the tender exasperation you feel towards someone you love who has done something foolish, or that particular exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness, but from emotional depletion after a day of pretending to feel things you do not actually feel. In English, we must construct elaborate phrases and sentences to approximate these concepts, borrowing from other languages when possible, or describing them through metaphor and analogy rather than naming them directly. The mechanism behind lexical gaps operates through a simple but profound reality about how languages develop. They emerge organically from the experiences and priorities of the communities that speak them, which means that not every possible human experience receives its own dedicated word, no matter how common that experience might be. A language develops vocabulary around what matters most to its speakers, what they encounter most frequently, what they need to discuss and negotiate in their daily lives. Portuguese speakers have the word saudade to describe a deep emotional state, combining longing, melancholy, and nostalgia all at once. German speakers use schadenfreude for the pleasure taken in another's misfortune. Japanese offers kamorbai for the way sunlight filters through trees. Yet English speakers, despite having one of the world's largest vocabularies, still find themselves without precise words for countless experiences. What persists as particularly paradoxical about lexical gaps is that they highlight the fundamental inadequacy of language itself, and yet we continue to rely on language as though it were sufficient, filling these gaps with awkward circumlocutions and approximate descriptions, acting as though our words fully capture our inner worlds when they demonstrably do not. We've normalized this incompleteness so thoroughly that we rarely notice it, moving through our days with feelings and experiences that have no names, yet we don't experience this absence as a crisis or even as a significant problem. Perhaps this acceptance reveals something essential about human resilience. We possess an almost infinite capacity to experience what we cannot name, to live fully within the spaces between our words, suggesting that language's incompleteness is not a failure we must overcome, but rather a fundamental condition we've learned to inhabit with grace.